Carl Jung explained 13 spiritual shifts that happen when your soul refuses to stay small. There's something happening to you that you haven't been able to name. You've felt it in the middle of the night when sleep refuses to come and your mind races through questions that have no comfortable answers. You've felt it in moments of success when you achieve exactly what you thought you wanted, only to discover that the victory tastes like ash in your mouth. You've felt it in the strange coincidences that seem too perfect to be random, in the sudden inability to tolerate conversations that once felt normal, in the inexplicable restlessness that makes your own life feel like a costume that no longer fits. What if I told you that everything you've been experiencing, the anxiety, the dissatisfaction, the mysterious pulling towards something you can't articulate, the feeling that you're living someone else's life, what if none of this is a problem? What if it's not a sign that something is wrong with you, but rather the most profound indication that something is finally going right? Carl Jung spent his entire life studying a phenomenon he called individuation, the psyche's innate drive toward wholeness. And what he discovered is this: your soul has an intelligence far older and wiser than your conscious mind. When that soul begins to expand beyond the narrow confines you've been living in, when it refuses to stay small anymore, it creates a rebellion, a sacred uprising from within. Jung wrote something that should change how you understand your own discomfort. The psyche is not of today. Its ancestry goes back many millions of years. Individual consciousness is only the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth. Think about what he's really saying here. Your conscious awareness, everything you think of as you, is just the visible bloom of something vast and ancient growing beneath the surface. And right now, in this moment of your life, that ancient something is pushing upward with a force that's cracking the concrete of your carefully constructed existence. You've probably noticed it already. Maybe you've achieved everything you were supposed to want: the relationship, the career, the house, the appearance of success. And yet there's this hollow feeling, this sense that you're performing a role in a play you never auditioned for. Or perhaps you've started experiencing synchronicities so perfect they feel impossible. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and within hours they message you. You need specific information, and a book falls off a shelf directly in front of you with exactly what you needed to know. You make a decision aligned with your deepest truth, and suddenly impossible doors swing open, while the old familiar paths close behind you with absolute finality. These aren't coincidences. This is your soul announcing itself. This is the ancient intelligence Jung spoke of, breaking through the surface of your carefully managed life, refusing to be contained any longer. But here's what makes this moment so dangerous and so necessary. The rebellion of the soul feels like a crisis. It feels like you're falling apart when actually you're falling together. The person you thought you had to be, constructed from parental expectations, cultural programming, peer pressure, and survival strategies, that person is experiencing a death, and like any death, it's terrifying. But unlike physical death, this one is followed by a resurrection, not into who you were, but into who you actually are. I know this because I've lived through this exact rebellion. There was a period in my life when everything looked perfect from the outside. Successful career, impressive title, relationships that appeared functional. And yet, I woke up every morning with a crushing weight on my chest, a feeling that I was suffocating in a life that had become too small for what was growing inside me. I thought I was depressed. I thought something was broken in me that needed fixing. It took me months to realize that nothing was broken, something was breaking free. Jung understood this process better than perhaps any psychologist in history. He recognized that the human psyche doesn't want to stay in comfortable containers. It wants to expand, to encompass more shadow and more light, to become whole rather than merely acceptable. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. But eventually, the soul will not be ignored. Eventually, it stages its rebellion, and that rebellion manifests in very specific, recognizable shifts, 13 of them to be exact. 13 distinct transformations that occur when your soul refuses to stay small anymore. These shifts don't happen all at once, and they don't always happen in the same order. But when they begin, there's a momentum to them that becomes impossible to reverse. It's like pulling a single thread that unravels an entire sweater, except what you're unraveling is the false self, and what emerges underneath is the truth of who you've always been. The first shift is the death of who you thought you had to be. The second is a sudden visceral intolerance for superficiality. The third is the emergence of irrational knowing, intuitive wisdom that bypasses logic entirely. The fourth is compulsive truthtelling, even when lying would be more convenient. The fifth is the experience of time collapsing and synchronicities multiplying exponentially. The sixth is fierce boundary consciousness, a non-negotiable protection of your energy and soul space. The seventh is a creative imperative, a demanding need to express something that words alone can't capture. The eighth is relationship upheaval, as connections either deepen dramatically or dissolve completely. The ninth is physical and energetic sensitivity awakening, where your body becomes a finely tuned instrument for detecting truth and energy. The 10th is discovering that time alone becomes medicine rather than punishment. The 11th is purpose clarity that has nothing to do with achievement. The 12th is comfort with paradox and mystery, the ability to hold opposing truths simultaneously. And the 13th, the final shift, is the point of no return, the recognition that you can never unsee what you've seen, never unknow what you've learned, never return to the smallness you once inhabited. These shifts are your initiation into what Jung called the individuation process, the becoming of who you truly are, not who your parents wanted you to be, not who your culture says you should be, not who your partner needs you to be or who your career demands you become, but who your soul knows itself to be. If you've been experiencing any of these shifts, if you felt the rebellion stirring in your own depths, I want you to comment the word expanding below, because what's happening to you isn't random and it isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. And understanding these 13 shifts, really understanding them, will transform how you interpret everything you've been experiencing. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are," but he also understood that this privilege comes with a price. The price is comfort. The price is the illusion of security. The price is the approval of people who loved the smaller version of you because it didn't threaten them or challenge their own smallness. And the question you're facing right now, whether you realize it consciously or not, is whether you're willing to pay that price. Because your soul is already paying it. Your soul has already decided. It's done with smallness, done with performance, done with pretending that the narrow life you've been living is anywhere close to adequate. And now it's just waiting for your conscious self to catch up, to stop resisting, to stop pathologizing the very symptoms that indicate your awakening. This script, these 13 shifts we're about to explore in depth, this is the map for that catching up. This is how you learn to read the rebellion happening inside you. This is how you discover that the discomfort you've been experiencing is actually the labor pains of your own rebirth. Jung believed that every human being contains within them the blueprint for their fullest expression, what he called the self with a capital S, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, actualized and potential. and he understood that the journey to that self, the process of individuation, is the most important work a human being can undertake, not because it makes you happy in any conventional sense, but because it makes you whole. And wholeness, unlike happiness, cannot be taken from you. So let's begin this journey together. Let's explore what happens when your soul refuses to stay small. Let's map the 13 shifts that transform not just how you live, but who you fundamentally understand yourself to be. Because on the other side of this rebellion, on the other side of the death of who you thought you had to be, there's a life waiting for you that you can't even imagine from where you're standing now. A life that doesn't require you to diminish yourself, to silence your truth, to squeeze into containers built for someone else entirely. Your soul already knows this life. It's been trying to show you glimpses of it through your restlessness, your synchronicities, your inexplicable knowing, your sudden inability to tolerate what you once accepted. And now, finally, we're going to learn its language. We're going to understand what it's been trying to tell you all along. The rebellion of the soul isn't something to be feared or fixed. It's something to be honored, understood, and followed to its inevitable conclusion, the full emergence of who you actually are. This is that map. These are those shifts. This is your initiation into the life your soul has always known was possible. Let's begin. Before we can understand the 13 shifts that occur when your soul expands, we need to understand exactly what's been keeping it contained. Because soul suppression isn't an accident. It's not random. It's a sophisticated system that begins the moment you're born and continues through every institution you pass through, every relationship you form, every choice you make based on what's acceptable rather than what's true. Let me tell you about Elena. She came to understand soul suppression at 40 years old, sitting in her corner office on the 37th floor of a building in Manhattan, looking out at a view that cost her company a fortune to secure, and feeling absolutely nothing. Elena had done everything right. She'd gone to the right schools, earned the right degrees, climbed the right ladders. She'd married a man her parents approved of, lived in a neighborhood that impressed her colleagues, cultivated friendships with people who mattered in her industry. From the outside, her life was a masterpiece of success. From the inside, it was a prison. Elena described it to me like this: I felt like I was watching myself live my life, like I was behind glass, seeing this person who looked like me, who had my name, who went through all the motions, but I couldn't feel any of it. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something because I wanted to, not because it was expected or because it would look good or because it made sense. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely excited about anything. And the worst part was, I couldn't even blame anyone. I had built this life myself, one careful decision at a time, each one designed to keep me safe, acceptable, successful, and now I was suffocating in my own creation. This is soul suppression in its most sophisticated form, not the dramatic suppression of trauma or abuse, though. Those exist too, but the slow, systematic suppression that comes from living according to a template that was never designed for your unique soul. Jung understood this intimately. He wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." And yet we live in a culture absolutely obsessed with recipes, with formulas, with the right way to build a life. Let me break down exactly how this suppression works, because once you understand the machinery, you can begin to dismantle it. The first force of soul containment is social conditioning, what I call the acceptable life template. From the moment you're born, you're being shown the acceptable paths. Get good grades, get into a good college, get a good job, get married, buy a house, have children, climb the ladder, save for retirement, repeat the cycle with your own children. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of these things if they're chosen from genuine soul alignment. But most people never ask whether this template fits them. They simply assume it's the path because it's the only path clearly marked. The template is transmitted through every channel. Your parents' hopes for you, even when they're loving, are often their own unlived lives projected onto your blank slate. Your school system rewards conformity and punishes deviation from the accepted curriculum, both academic and social. Your peer groups establish hierarchies based on who's following the template most successfully. Your media constantly shows you images of what success, beauty, love, and worthiness are supposed to look like. And slowly, imperceptibly, your own authentic desires get buried under layers of should. Jung called this the development of the persona, the social mask we wear to be acceptable to the collective. He wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between the individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual." The persona isn't inherently problematic. We all need some level of social adaptation to function in the world. But when the persona becomes the only self we know, when we completely identify with the mask and forget there's a face beneath it, we've entered the territory of soul suppression. The second force is what I call fear architecture, the systematic deployment of fear to keep you compliant. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of financial insecurity, fear of being alone, fear of judgment, fear of missing out, fear of being too much or not enough. These fears are cultivated deliberately by systems that benefit from your compliance. A workforce that's terrified of losing health insurance is a docile workforce. A population afraid of social rejection is easily controlled through shame. A person convinced they're one mistake away from catastrophe will never take risks that threaten the status quo. And here's the insidious part. Many of these fears are legitimate. You can lose your job. You can experience financial hardship. You can be rejected by your community. The fears aren't irrational, but they're amplified far beyond their actual probability and used to keep you making safe choices, small choices, choices that keep your soul in a container it has long since outgrown. The third force is comparison culture. Social media has weaponized this, but it existed long before Instagram. It's the constant measurement of your insides against other people's outsides. You compare your messy, complicated, doubt-filled internal experience to the curated highlight reels everyone else presents to the world, and you inevitably conclude that something is wrong with you. Everyone else seems to have it figured out. Everyone else seems confident, successful, happy, purposeful. You must be the only one struggling, the only one faking it, the only one questioning everything. Except you're not. Everyone is performing for everyone else, and everyone is suffering from the same illusion that everyone else's performance is their reality. Jung understood this deeply when he explored the collective unconscious and the archetypes that live in all of us. The struggles you're experiencing aren't unique to you. They're human. But comparison culture makes you feel isolated in your humanity, and that isolation makes you more likely to suppress whatever makes you different in a desperate attempt to fit in. The fourth force is busyness as anesthetic. Modern life is designed to keep you so occupied with tasks, obligations, notifications, and distractions that you never have time to stop and ask the dangerous questions. Questions like, is this actually what I want? Am I living authentically or performing? What would I do if I wasn't afraid? What is my soul trying to tell me? These questions are dangerous to the systems that depend on your compliance, so those systems keep you too busy to ask them. There's always another deadline, another obligation, another crisis to manage, another scroll through your feed to numb out with. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And one of the most effective avoidance strategies is simply staying too busy to look inward. You can spend an entire lifetime this way, postponing the confrontation with your own depth until some crisis, illness, loss, collapse forces you to stop. The fifth force is what I call spiritual materialism, a term borrowed from Chogyam Trungpa. This is perhaps the most subtle form of soul suppression because it disguises itself as growth. Spiritual materialism is when you turn even your awakening into another achievement system, another arena for your ego to compete in. You collect spiritual experiences like merit badges. You develop a new persona, the enlightened one, the conscious one, the awakened one. That's just another mask, perhaps more sophisticated than the previous one, but still a barrier to genuine encounter with your soul. You read the books, attend the workshops, cultivate the meditation practice, talk the spiritual talk, but you're using all of it to build a better ego, rather than to transcend the ego entirely. You're still performing, just for a different audience now. You're still measuring yourself against others, just using different metrics. You're still suppressing parts of yourself, just different parts. Now you suppress your anger because awakened people don't get angry. You suppress your desires because spiritual people transcend wanting. You suppress your humanness in service of an ideal that's just another form of the template. Jung warned against this explicitly. He said, "Enlightenment is not imagining figures of light, but making the darkness conscious." Real spiritual growth isn't about ascending into light and leaving the dark behind. It's about integrating the darkness, owning your shadow, becoming whole rather than merely good. But spiritual materialism wants the light without the work of descent. It wants transcendence without integration. And this keeps your soul just as suppressed as any conventional template. Perhaps more so because now you're convinced you're free. These five forces work together, creating what Elena experienced: soul claustrophobia. This is that feeling of being trapped in a life that looks successful, but feels suffocating. It's waking up with a sense of dread, even though nothing is overtly wrong. It's achieving your goals and feeling empty instead of fulfilled. It's having everything you're supposed to want and still feeling like something essential is missing. It's the growing awareness that you've built a beautiful cage, and you're locked inside it. Jung understood this phenomenon at the deepest level because he experienced it himself. After his break with Freud, during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung went through a period of intense psychological upheaval. He had achieved everything: professional recognition, a thriving practice, a family. And yet he felt compelled to descend into his own depths, to confront the unconscious material he'd been suppressing in service of professional success and social acceptability. It was terrifying. It nearly destroyed him, and it ultimately became the foundation for his entire body of work. He wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because accepting yourself completely means acknowledging all the ways you've been living inauthentically, all the parts of yourself you've suppressed to be acceptable, all the soul intelligence you've ignored in service of safety. It means confronting the gap between who you are and who you've been pretending to be. And that gap, once you really see it, cannot be unseen." This is where Elena found herself at 40. She could no longer not see the gap. She could no longer maintain the illusion that the performance was reality. Her soul was staging its rebellion, and no amount of busyness, no achievement, no comparison, no spiritual bypassing could suppress it anymore. And here's what's crucial to understand. This rebellion, this breaking through of the suppressed soul, isn't a breakdown, even though it feels like one. It's a breakthrough. Jung called it the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, of integrating conscious and unconscious, of developing a relationship with the self that's deeper than the ego's preferences and fears. But for individuation to begin, you have to recognize the suppression. You have to see the machinery that's been keeping your soul small. Because you cannot dismantle what you cannot see. You cannot choose differently if you don't realize you've been choosing according to someone else's template. I want you to pause here and ask yourself honestly, where have you been suppressing your soul? What is the acceptable life template you've been following, and who created that template, you or the collective? What fears have been making your decisions? Who have you been comparing yourself to, and what parts of yourself have you judged as inadequate in that comparison? What are you staying busy with to avoid asking the dangerous questions? And if you're on a spiritual path, are you genuinely transforming or just building a more sophisticated ego? These aren't comfortable questions. Jung promised us nothing about this work would be comfortable, but comfort isn't the goal. Wholeness is the goal. And wholeness requires confronting the ways you've been fragmenting yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for your full soul. If you're feeling that soul claustrophobia Elena described, if you're recognizing yourself in this anatomy of suppression, I want you to comment "breaking free" below, because recognition is the first step. You cannot transform what you refuse to acknowledge, but once you see it, once you really understand how the suppression works, it begins to lose its power over you. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The 5 forces of soul suppression work precisely because they remain unconscious. They operate beneath your awareness, shaping your choices, limiting your possibilities, keeping you in patterns you never consciously chose. But the moment you make them conscious, the moment you see exactly how your soul has been contained, you reclaim the power to choose differently. And that choice, that conscious choosing of authenticity over acceptance, of soul truth over social approval, of wholeness over comfort, that's where the 13 shifts begin. That's where your soul stops being suppressed and starts expressing itself with a force that will reorganize your entire life. But first, you had to understand the prison, because you cannot break out of something you don't realize. You're in, and now you know. Now you see the bars of the cage you've been calling home. Now you understand exactly what your soul has been pushing against all this time. The rebellion is no longer mysterious. It's inevitable. And the 13 shifts we're about to explore in depth, these are what happen when you finally stop resisting that rebellion and let your soul do what it's been trying to do all along. Expand beyond the narrow confines of acceptability into the vast territory of your authentic being. The suppression phase is ending. The expansion phase is beginning. Everything you've been experiencing that felt wrong, it's about to make perfect sense. The first shift that occurs when your soul refuses to stay small is the most disorienting and the most liberating. It's the collapse of the false self. And it feels exactly like dying. Let me tell you about Marcus. For 23 years, Marcus had been a successful attorney at one of the most prestigious firms in Chicago. He'd wanted to be a lawyer since he was 12, or at least that's the story he told himself and everyone else. His father was a lawyer. His grandfather was a lawyer. In the photographs on the walls of his family home, there were lawyers stretching back 5 generations. It wasn't just a career path. It was a legacy, an identity, a fundamental answer to the question, who are you? Marcus was good at law. He was exceptional at it, actually. He won cases that other attorneys thought were unwinnable. He brought in clients. He made partner ahead of schedule. Everything external validated that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And then one Tuesday morning, sitting at his desk preparing for a major trial, something broke inside him. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. It was quiet, internal, absolute. He looked at the case files in front of him and could not make himself care. Couldn't force himself to care. couldn't make himself care. The mechanism that had allowed him to generate enthusiasm for legal work, to perform passion for cases, to identify with the role of attorney. It simply stopped functioning. He described it to me like this. It was like someone turned off a switch I didn't know was artificial. For 23 years, I'd been running on this energy that I thought was mine, my ambition, my passion, my purpose, and suddenly I could see it clearly. None of it was mine. It was all borrowed. Borrowed from my father's expectations, from family legacy, from the image I'd built, from the identity I'd constructed. And the moment I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't make myself pretend anymore. The attorney mask just fell off, and there was nobody underneath. This is what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow of the persona. The persona, remember, is the social mask we wear to be acceptable to the collective. It's the constructed identity that allows us to function in society. And for most of our lives, we're completely identified with this mask. We think the mask is who we are. We think the role is the reality. Marcus thought he was an attorney, not that he worked as an attorney, but that attorney was the fundamental answer to who he was. Strip that away, and he had no idea what remained. Which is why this first shift feels like death, because in a very real sense, it is death. The death of performed identity, the death of who you thought you had to be, the death of the carefully constructed self that's been running your life, while your actual soul watched from somewhere deep inside, waiting for this exact moment. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But before you can become who you truly are, you have to stop being who you thought you had to be, and that requires a death. Not a metaphorical death, an actual death of identity, complete with grief, confusion, emptiness, and the terrifying question, if I'm not who I thought I was, then who am I?" Let me break down exactly what this false self-collapse process looks like, because if you're experiencing it right now, you need to understand that what feels like falling apart is actually falling together. The first stage is performance fatigue. This is what Marcus experienced, the sudden inability to maintain the mask. You've been performing an identity for so long that it's become exhausting, and your psyche simply doesn't have the energy to continue anymore. It's not that you decide to stop performing. You literally can't continue. The mechanism breaks. This often happens after years of success, which is why it's so confusing. You've finally achieved what you worked toward, and instead of feeling fulfilled, you feel empty. Instead of being able to celebrate, you can't make yourself care. The performance fatigue isn't laziness or depression, though it can be misdiagnosed as both. It's your soul withdrawing energy from a false identity that it's done supporting. It's your psyche saying, "I will no longer give life force to this performance." The energy that animated your false self is being recalled, and without that energy, the persona can't be maintained. The second stage is authenticity hunger. Once the performance starts crumbling, you become aware of a desperate craving for something real. You can't tolerate surface conversations anymore. You can't force yourself to network, to schmooze, to play social games. You start gravitating toward depth, books that speak to your actual questions, conversations that go beneath the surface, environments where you can let down the guard you didn't realize you'd been holding for years. Marcus described walking out of a networking event 15 minutes after arriving because he couldn't breathe in there. Not metaphorically, he felt like he was suffocating. The moment he stepped outside and took off his tie, he could breathe again. That's authenticity hunger manifesting somatically. Your body begins to reject inauthenticity the way it would reject poison. The third stage is identity confusion, and this is the most disorienting phase. When the false self collapses and authenticity hunger emerges, you're left with a fundamental question you cannot answer. Who am I without the roles, the achievements, the identities I've been performing? Marcus wasn't an attorney anymore, but he didn't know what he was. He'd defined himself by his career for so long that without it, he was nobody, or at least that's how it felt. This is the phase where people panic, where they try to quickly construct a new identity to fill the void, where they jump from career to career, relationship to relationship, identity to identity, desperately seeking something to stand on. But Jung warned against this. The emptiness, the void, the not knowing, this is sacred space. This is the fertile darkness where your actual self can emerge. Rushing to fill it with a new mask, a new performance, a new false self, just continues the cycle. The fourth stage is the grief period, because what's dying isn't meaningless. The false self served you. It kept you safe, acceptable, functional in the world. It allowed you to navigate social systems and meet basic needs. There's real loss here, and it needs to be grieved. Marcus grieved his identity as an attorney. He grieved the approval of his father. He grieved the clear path forward that evaporated the moment he stopped being able to perform that role. He grieved the certainty of knowing who he was, even if who he wasn't real. Jung understood that individuation requires descent before ascent, death before rebirth. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The grief is part of the process. You cannot skip it. You cannot bypass it with positive thinking or spiritual platitudes. The false self dies, and death is attended by grief, period." The fifth and final stage is what I call spacious emptiness. After the grief moves through, there's a quality of openness that emerges. You're not the person you were, but you're not yet the person you're becoming. You're in the liminal space, the threshold, what Jung called the temenos, the sacred container where transformation occurs. This emptiness isn't nihilistic. It's pregnant with possibility. It's the space where your actual soul can finally speak without the false self drowning it out. Marcus spent 6 months in this stage. He took a sabbatical from the firm, which turned into a resignation. He stopped trying to figure out what he should do next and started simply paying attention to what wanted to emerge. He started painting, something he hadn't done since childhood. He took long walks without destination. He sat with the emptiness and let it teach him. And slowly, organically, without forcing, a different truth began to emerge. Not a new identity to perform, but an authentic way of being that didn't require performance. Marcus discovered he had no interest in law as a career, but profound interest in restorative justice as a calling. Not a job title, but a way of moving through the world. Not a role, but a relationship with himself and his community that felt true. This is what the death of the false self creates space for, the emergence of actual self. Not another persona, not another mask, but the genuine article, the soul's authentic expression, what Jung called the self with a capital S. But here's what you need to understand about this first shift. It's not optional once it begins. You can't stop it. You can resist it, delay it, make it more painful than necessary, but you cannot prevent it. Once your soul decides it's done with the performance, once it withdraws its life force from the false identity, that identity will collapse. The only choice you have is how consciously you allow it to happen. If you fight it, if you try to prop up the dying persona with willpower and effort and desperation, you'll suffer immensely. If you allow it, if you trust the death and the emptiness that follows, you'll discover that on the other side is a way of being that doesn't require the exhausting maintenance the false self demanded. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And accepting yourself completely means letting the false self die without trying to rescue it, without clinging to who you thought you had to be, without rushing to construct a new, acceptable identity. It means sitting in the void and trusting that something true will emerge from that darkness." I need to tell you something personal here. I experienced this exact death 7 years ago. I'd built an entire identity around being the reliable one, the person everyone could count on, who never said no, who prioritized others' needs over my own, who derived worth from being needed. It wasn't a career identity like Marcus, but it was just as totalizing. It informed every relationship, every choice, every interaction, and then my body forced the issue. I developed chronic fatigue so severe I couldn't maintain the performance anymore. I literally didn't have the energy to be the reliable one. And when I couldn't be that anymore, I had no idea who I was. The grief was profound. The emptiness was terrifying. I remember sitting on my therapist's couch sobbing, "If I'm not the person everyone needs, then what's the point of me existing at all?" That question haunted me for months, and slowly, very slowly, a different answer emerged. Not an answer I constructed intellectually, but one that arose from the emptiness itself. You exist to be yourself, not to be useful, not to be needed, not to be the reliable one, just to be authentically, messily, imperfectly yourself. And that self is enough. That self has always been enough. That realization changed everything, but I could only arrive at it by allowing the false self to die completely, by sitting in the emptiness without rushing to fill it, by trusting the death and the grief and the not knowing. The mirror effect with this first shift is profound. The people in your life who trigger you by not living up to their potential are reflecting your own terror of releasing false identity. You see them as wasting their gifts, playing small, not becoming who they could be. But what you're really seeing is your own fear. Because if they let go of who they're supposed to be, if they allow their false self to die without knowing what comes next, then you might have to do the same. And that's terrifying. Conversely, people who seem to be authentically themselves might trigger envy or judgment. How dare they live so freely while you're still trapped in performance? But that trigger is actually a calling. It's your soul saying, that's possible for you too. That freedom, that authenticity, that aliveness, it's not reserved for special people. It's your birthright. You just have to be willing to let who you thought you had to be die. Here's the warning. Don't rush this process. Don't try to speed through the death to get to the rebirth. Don't immediately construct a new identity just to avoid the emptiness. The spacious emptiness is sacred. It's where the alchemy happens. Jung spent years in his own confrontation with the unconscious, descending into territory that terrified him, resisting the urge to quickly return to functioning as a respectable psychiatrist. And from that descent came his life's work, a complete transformation of how we understand the human psyche. Your descent, your death of false self, mightn't produce a new body of psychological theory, but it will produce something infinitely more valuable. You, the actual you, the you that's been waiting beneath the performance your entire life, the you that your soul has always known you could be if you just let the false version die. If you're in this first shift right now, if you're experiencing the collapse of who you thought you had to be, I want you to comment "dying to live" below, because that's exactly what's happening. The false self is dying so your true self can live. And while it's terrifying, it's also sacred, it's also necessary. It's also the beginning of everything that comes next. Marcus told me something profound a year after his false self collapsed. He said, "I'm not more successful now by any external measure. I make less money. I have less prestige, but I'm more alive than I've ever been. I'm actually present in my life instead of watching myself perform in it. And that aliveness, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not for the partnership, not for my father's approval, not for the certainty of knowing exactly who I was supposed to be, because now I know who I actually am. And that knowing is worth every moment of terror in the void. That's the promise on the other side of this first shift. Not certainty, not a new, perfect identity, not the elimination of all difficulty, but aliveness, presence, the indescribable relief of no longer having to perform, who you are, of simply being able to exist as you actually are. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." The death of the false self is the awakening. It's the moment you stop looking outside for the script of who you should be and start looking inside at who you actually are. It's the moment you stop dreaming someone else's dream and wake up to your own life. And here's the final truth about this first shift. Once it happens, there's no going back. You can't unknow what you've learned about yourself. You can't resurrect the false self and make it feel real again. The mask, once you see it as a mask, can never again be confused with your face. You've crossed a threshold. You've entered territory from which there is no return to innocence, but you don't want to go back. That's what you'll discover. Even in the hardest moments of not knowing who you are, even in the grief of the false self's death, even in the terror of the emptiness, you don't actually want to return to the performance. Because beneath all the fear is a relief so profound you might not even recognize it at first. The relief of finally being allowed to stop pretending. The relief of your soul no longer having to fight against your own performed identity. The relief of beginning to tell the truth about who you are, even when that truth is simply, "I don't know yet, but I'm finding out." This is the first shift, the death of who you thought you had to be. And it creates the foundation for everything else we're about to explore. Because once the false self dies, once you're willing to exist in authentic not knowing rather than performed certainty, the other 12 shifts can begin in earnest. Your soul has been waiting for this moment, for the moment when you'd finally be willing to let who you're not die so who you are can emerge. And now that you're here, now that the first death has occurred or is occurring, everything accelerates. The rebellion has truly begun, and there's no stopping it now. The second shift that occurs when your soul refuses to stay small is sudden, visceral, and socially devastating. You become physically incapable of tolerating superficial interactions and meaningless activities. What once felt normal, cocktail party conversations, networking events, small talk about weather and sports, gossip about people you don't care about, consumption as leisure, all of it becomes unbearable, not annoying, unbearable. Let me tell you about Jennifer. She was a marketing executive at a tech company, someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of networking, of working a room, of knowing exactly what to say to make connections that advanced her career. She was good at it. She actually enjoyed it, or thought she did, until one evening at an industry mixer when everything changed. She was in mid-conversation with a potential client, doing her usual dance, mirroring their energy, finding common ground, laughing at mediocre jokes, presenting the carefully curated version of herself that made people comfortable and interested. And then, in the middle of a sentence, something inside her just stopped. She told me, "It was like I could suddenly see the entire interaction from outside myself. I could see both of us performing, both of us saying things we didn't mean or didn't care about, both of us pretending this shallow exchange was meaningful connection, and I felt physically ill, not metaphorically uncomfortable, genuinely nauseous. I excused myself, went to the bathroom and started crying because I realized I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't have one more conversation about quarterly projections or industry trends or networking strategies. I wanted to talk about what actually matters, why we're here, what we're afraid of, what brings us alive, what we've lost and what we're looking for. But you can't say that at a networking event, so I left, just walked out, and I've barely been able to attend professional functions since. This is the second shift in its full force. Your soul, having begun its expansion with the death of false self, now refuses to waste energy on surface-level existence. It's as if you've been granted new vision, and what you see is the hollowness beneath most social interactions, the performance beneath the performance, the desperate avoidance of depth that characterizes so much of modern life. Jung understood this intimately. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But most interactions aren't meetings of personalities. They're meetings of personas, masks meeting masks, performances meeting performances. And once you've begun shedding your own mask, once you've tasted authentic depth, these persona-to-persona exchanges become intolerable. Let me break down exactly what becomes unbearable after this shift, because understanding it helps you navigate the social earthquake it creates. First, performative conversations. These are exchanges where both parties are saying things designed to create an impression rather than communicate truth. The job interview where you pretend your weaknesses are actually strengths. The first date where you present your highlight reel. The social media post where you caption a curated image with profound-sounding words you don't actually mean. After the shift, you can see the performance in real time, and participating in it feels like betraying yourself. Second, status games. The subtle and not so subtle competitions that dominate so many social spaces. Who has the better title, the bigger house, the more impressive vacation, the more successful children, the more spiritual practice, the more conscious awareness. You can suddenly see these games for what they are: elaborate distractions from genuine self-worth, desperate attempts to establish value through external comparison, and you can't make yourself care who wins. Third, gossip. Not just the malicious kind, but any conversation centered on discussing people who aren't present, especially when it's done to bond through judgment or shared superiority. After the shift, gossip feels toxic in your body. You can feel your energy draining as you participate in it. Jennifer described it as spiritual junk food, fills time but leaves you empty and slightly disgusted with yourself. Fourth, consumption as identity. The conversations that revolve around products, purchases, possessions, what you bought, what you want to buy, what others bought, what's worth buying. The reduction of human experience to consumer choices. After the shift, these conversations feel profoundly sad. You can see the hole people are trying to fill with objects, and you can see that it never works, and participating in the delusion becomes painful. Fifth, pseudo-intimacy. This is perhaps the most subtle form of superficiality, the simulation of depth without actual vulnerability, sharing deep thoughts without sharing actual struggles, discussing spirituality without admitting spiritual crisis, talking about authenticity while still performing. It's depth as another mask, consciousness as another identity, vulnerability as another strategy. After the shift, you can smell the inauthenticity immediately, and it's worse than obvious superficiality because it pretends to be what you're actually hungry for. Sixth, spiritual bypassing disguised as depth. Using spiritual concepts to avoid genuine emotional work. Everything happens for a reason, deployed to avoid feeling grief. We're all one, used to bypass personal boundaries. Just raise your vibration instead of addressing systemic injustice. After the shift, you recognize this as another form of superficiality, the avoidance of difficult human realities dressed up in spiritual language. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." This intolerance for superficiality is actually deep compassion, compassion for the preciousness of life, for the brevity of our time here, for the tragedy of wasting our limited existence on performances and pretense. It's not judgment of others, though it can be mistaken for that. It's fierce protection of depth, of truth, of genuine connection. But let me be honest about the cost, because this shift creates real social consequences. Relationships built on superficiality will fall away, and in our culture, that's a lot of relationships. Friendships that existed primarily to fill time, to avoid loneliness, to maintain social status, these cannot survive the shift to intolerance for superficiality. Because once you can't participate in superficial exchange anymore, these relationships have nothing to sustain them. Jennifer lost most of her professional network within a year, not through dramatic confrontations, but through natural drift. She stopped attending events she couldn't stomach. She stopped reaching out to connections that felt hollow. She let relationships that required performance fade. And for months, she was lonely, genuinely lonely, because even though those connections were superficial, they were still human contact. They still filled her calendar and made her feel part of something. This is what I call soul-aligned solitude, and it's a necessary phase. Jung spent years in relative isolation during his confrontation with the unconscious, limiting his social interactions to those few relationships that could meet him in genuine depth. He understood that you cannot simultaneously maintain superficial connections and descend into genuine depth. The energies are incompatible. But here's what happens if you trust this phase. The people who can meet you in depth start appearing, not through networking, not through strategic connection, but through what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. You're in a bookstore and strike up a conversation with someone reading the same book, and within minutes you're discussing the fundamental questions of existence. You attend a small gathering and connect with one person so genuinely that you talk for 3 hours and lose track of time completely. You join a community oriented around something that actually matters to you, and you find your people. These depth connections don't feel like the old superficial ones. They're not numerous, they're not convenient. They don't fill your social calendar with constant activity. But they're real, they're nourishing, they're mutual. Not you performing for someone or someone performing for you, but both of you showing up authentically and creating something neither of you could create alone. This is what Jung meant by the meeting of two personalities. A genuine meeting requires both people to show up without masks, to risk being seen, to trust that their authentic self is worthy of connection. And after the shift to intolerance for superficiality, this is the only kind of meeting you can tolerate anymore. Let me give you what I call the depth compass, a way to navigate this shift without becoming isolated or superior. Your emotional and physical reactions become your guide. Pay attention to how your body responds to different interactions. Do you feel energized or depleted? Do you feel more yourself or less yourself? Do you feel connected or performing? Jennifer developed an exquisite sensitivity to this. She could feel within minutes of a conversation whether it was going to nourish or drain her, not through judgment of the other person, but through attention to her own somatic response. Genuine conversations made her feel more alive, more present, more herself. Superficial ones made her feel flat, disconnected, like she was disappearing into performance. She learned to honor this compass absolutely. If a conversation started going superficial, she would gently try to redirect to depth. Ask a real question, share something vulnerable, name the elephant in the room. And if the conversation couldn't go there, she would gracefully exit rather than force herself to endure it. Not rudely, not with judgment, but with firm boundary around her energy and soul space. This is crucial. The intolerance for superficiality is not permission to judge others as shallow. This is where the shadow of this shift lives, and you have to watch for it carefully. It's very easy to develop spiritual superiority, to look at people engaged in small talk or status games or consumption culture and feel smugly above it all. I'm too conscious for that now. I'm too evolved. I see through it. But Jung warned extensively against this kind of inflation. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. When you judge others for superficiality, you're often projecting your own shadow material, parts of yourself that want to be unconscious, to avoid difficulty, to stay in comfortable shallowness. The judgment is a defense against seeing that you, too, are capable of superficiality, that you, too, sometimes prefer the easy conversation over the real one, that you, too, sometimes hide behind performance because vulnerability is terrifying. I have to be vulnerable about my own experience with this shift. When I first became intolerant of superficiality, I was insufferable. I judged everyone who couldn't meet me in depth. I saw myself as more conscious, more evolved, more real. I walked around with this subtle superiority that I disguised as authenticity. And it wasn't until someone I deeply respected called me out on it that I saw what I was doing. They said, "Your intolerance for superficiality has become its own form of shallow behavior. You're so busy judging everyone else's masks that you're wearing the mask of the authentic one. You're performing depth the way other people perform success, and that performance is just as hollow." It devastated me, and it was exactly what I needed to hear, because they were right. I'd turned my awakening to depth into another identity, another way to feel superior, another mask. And that mask was actually preventing genuine depth, because real depth requires humility, vulnerability, recognition that we're all struggling with the same fundamental human challenges. The mirror effect with this shift is powerful. The people you judge most harshly for being superficial are reflecting aspects of yourself you haven't integrated. Maybe it's the part of you that wants easy connection without risk. Maybe it's the part that wants to belong even if it requires performance. Maybe it's the part that's terrified of genuine vulnerability and prefers the safety of shallow exchange. And the people who trigger you by being too intense or too heavy or always going deep, they're reflecting something, too. Maybe your own fear of being too much. Maybe your internalized belief that depth is inappropriate or burdensome. Maybe your worry that if you show up fully authentic, you'll overwhelm people and end up alone. Both mirrors are teaching you. Both are showing you something about your relationship with depth and superficiality, and integrating both, honoring your need for depth while maintaining compassion for human complexity. That's the mature expression of this shift. Here's the paradox that makes this shift so powerful. Your intolerance for superficiality is actually profound respect for life's preciousness. When you refuse to waste time on hollow interactions, you're not being antisocial. You're honoring the sacred brevity of existence. You're refusing to spend your limited days on earth engaged in exchanges that diminish rather than expand you. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And becoming who you truly are requires protecting the time and energy needed for genuine self-exploration, authentic connection, and meaningful engagement with existence. Superficiality is a thief of that time and energy. Your intolerance is simply your soul defending its own expansion. But, and this is important, depth isn't always verbal. It isn't always in intense conversations about meaning and existence. Sometimes depth is sitting in comfortable silence with someone. Sometimes it's a knowing glance that communicates everything without words. Sometimes it's working alongside someone in shared purpose. Sometimes it's playing music together or creating art together or simply being present together without agenda. After her shift, Jennifer discovered depth in unexpected places. A monthly gathering where people brought instruments and just played together, no performance, no agenda, just improvised music. A volunteer position at a hospice where the work itself created depth without needing to discuss it. A hiking group where the shared experience of nature and challenge created bonds that didn't require constant verbal processing. She learned that depth isn't a formula, it's a frequency, and you recognize it by how it makes you feel, more alive, more present, more yourself, and you protect it by refusing to dilute it with the superficiality that our culture constantly pushes on us as normal. If you're experiencing this shift right now, if you've discovered you can no longer tolerate superficial interactions and meaningless activities, I want you to comment "craving depth" below, because you're not alone in this. You're not antisocial or difficult or too intense. Your soul is demanding that your external life match your internal expansion. And that demand, while socially inconvenient, is evidence of your growth, not your dysfunction. The relationships that fall away in this shift were never meant to survive your expansion. They were aligned with who you were pretending to be, not who you actually are, and the loneliness you might feel is temporary. The space between relationships that aren't real and relationships that are. Trust that space. Honor that solitude. Let it teach you the difference between connection and performance. Because on the other side of this shift, the relationships you form will be so much richer, deeper, more nourishing than what you left behind. Not more numerous, not more convenient, not more socially impressive, but real. Genuinely, soul-feedingly real. Jung wrote, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm, which is not easily disturbed. It is just these intense conflicts and their conflagration which are needed to produce valuable and lasting results." The conflict between your soul's need for depth and society's insistence on superficiality, this is one of those intense conflicts. And overcoming it by choosing depth, by honoring your intolerance, by protecting your energy for what actually matters, this produces the valuable and lasting result of a life aligned with your actual soul, rather than your performed persona. The intolerance for superficiality isn't a problem to be solved. It's a gift to be honored. It's your soul's fierce protection of its own expansion, its refusal to leak energy into hollow exchanges, its insistence on spending your precious life on what actually nourishes you. Trust it, follow it, let it reorganize your social life completely, because what you're moving toward, genuine depth, authentic connection, meaningful engagement, is worth every superficial relationship you leave behind. The second shift is complete when you stop apologizing for your need for depth and start protecting it as the sacred requirement it actually is. When you stop trying to make yourself more palatable to people who prefer superficiality and start seeking out the ones who can meet you where you actually live. Your soul isn't being difficult, it's being discerning, and that discernment will lead you to connections more real than anything superficiality could ever create. The third shift that occurs when your soul expands is perhaps the most mystifying and the most powerful. You begin accessing a form of wisdom that bypasses rational thought entirely. You start knowing things you have no logical reason to know. You make decisions based on intuition that proves eerily accurate. You become, in Jung's language, fluent in the unconscious. Let me tell you about David. He was a data scientist, someone whose entire professional identity was built on rationality, on provable hypotheses, on decisions supported by evidence. If you couldn't quantify it, measure it, or test it, David didn't trust it. This wasn't just his job. It was his worldview. Logic was reality, and intuition was just pattern recognition you hadn't made conscious yet. And then something shifted. He started having experiences he couldn't explain through his rational framework. He'd wake up knowing he needed to call his sister, and when he did, she'd be in crisis, needing exactly his support. He'd feel a sudden urge to take a different route to work, and later discover there was a massive accident on his usual path. He'd meet someone new and know within seconds, not think, but know, whether they were trustworthy or not, and be proven right every time. The most dramatic instance happened during a job interview. On paper, the position was perfect. Better pay, prestigious company, work aligned with his skills. During the interview, everything went well. They offered him the job on the spot, and David felt a clear, unmistakable knowing in his body, do not take this. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't based on any red flags he could articulate. It was just absolute certainty. He turned down the job. His rational mind screamed at him for weeks. What kind of idiot turns down a perfect opportunity based on a feeling? 3 months later, that company was exposed for massive fraud, and everyone hired in that period was implicated in the investigation. David's irrational knowing had saved his career and possibly his freedom. This is what Jung called intuition as a primary function, one of 4 ways the psyche perceives and processes reality. Most of Western culture privileges thinking and sensing, the rational functions. We're taught to distrust feeling and intuition, the irrational functions. But Jung understood that all 4 are equally valid ways of knowing, and that intuition specifically accesses information through the unconscious that the conscious mind cannot reach through logic alone. He wrote, "Intuition is perception via the unconscious, not mystical woo-woo, not making things up, but genuine perception through a channel that operates differently than rational analysis. The unconscious picks up patterns, connections, and information that consciousness filters out. And when your soul expands, when you begin the individuation process, this intuitive channel opens wider. Let me break down the forms this irrational knowing takes, because it manifests differently for different people, and understanding the variety helps you recognize it in your own experience. First, sudden, inexplicable certainty. This is what David experienced, a knowing that arrives complete, without supporting evidence or logical argument. You just know, not think, not believe, not hope. No. It often comes in a flash, sometimes accompanied by physical sensation, a dropping in your stomach, a warmth in your chest, a tingling at the base of your skull. The content of the knowing is clear, but if someone asks you to explain your reasoning, you can't. You just know. Second, body-based knowing. Your body registers truth before your mind understands it. You meet someone and your body contracts. Muscles tense, breathing shallows, energy pulls back. Or you enter a space and your body expands, shoulders drop, breath deepens. You feel more alive. This isn't conscious assessment. It's somatic. Intelligence, and it's remarkably accurate. David learned to trust his body's responses more than his mind's evaluations. Third, symbolic communication through dreams. Jung devoted enormous attention to dreams as the language of the unconscious. After this shift, your dreams become more vivid, more memorable, more obviously significant, and they start giving you information, warnings, guidance, solutions to problems you're wrestling with. Not in literal terms always, but in symbols that your unconscious mind understands, even when your conscious mind is confused. David started keeping a dream journal and was shocked at how often his dreams presaged real events or revealed solutions to problems he was stuck on. A recurring dream about being underwater led him to realize he was drowning in work obligations and needed to set boundaries. A dream about his deceased grandfather pointing at a specific book led him to that book in a store, and it contained exactly the perspective he needed for a life decision he was wrestling with. Fourth, synchronistic guidance. This is related to the 5th shift we'll explore in depth later, but it's also a form of irrational knowing. You think of a question, and within hours, someone mentions exactly the book that addresses it. You're struggling with a decision, and you overhear a stranger's conversation that speaks directly to your situation. You need a specific resource, and it appears through a coincidence too perfect to be random. Jung wrote extensively about synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that reveals the interconnection between psyche and matter. After this shift, you start recognizing synchronistic events as a form of knowing, as the universe's or the unconscious's way of communicating with you. Fifth, creative downloads. This is when ideas, insights, or solutions arrive fully formed, often in altered states. Just before sleep, just after waking, during meditation, in the shower, on a walk. You're not consciously working on the problem, and suddenly the answer is just there. Artists and scientists have described this for centuries, but after this shift, it becomes a regular experience. The unconscious does the work and presents the results to consciousness as a gift. David, the data scientist, started having mathematical insights this way that he couldn't explain. He'd be stuck on an analytical problem, go for a run to clear his head, and return with the solution fully formed, not through conscious reasoning, but through irrational knowing. Now, here's where this gets challenging. Learning to distinguish genuine irrational knowing from fear, wishful thinking, or ego masquerading as intuition. Because not every impulse is soul guidance, not every feeling is truth. The rational mind can hijack the intuitive channel and feed you its own agenda dressed up as knowing. Let me give you the irrational knowing integration framework, a way to work with this shift skillfully. Step 1. Notice the knowing. Pay attention to the quality of experience when irrational knowing arises. For most people, genuine intuition has a distinctive feeling, calm, certain, quiet. It doesn't argue or justify itself. It doesn't create anxiety. It simply is. Fear-based impulses, by contrast, feel frantic, urgent, desperate. Wishful thinking feels hopeful but uncertain, like trying to convince yourself. Ego-driven impulses feel excited but hollow, like they're trying too hard. David learned that his genuine intuitions felt like recognition, like he was remembering something he already knew rather than discovering something new. Fear-based impulses felt like scrambling. Ego-driven impulses felt like performing, even in his own mind. Step 2. Distinguish it from fear or wish. This requires brutal honesty with yourself. Is this knowing, or is this what you want to be true? Is this intuition, or is this anxiety trying to keep you safe? Ask yourself, what am I afraid of? What am I hoping for? If this knowing is wrong, what does that cost me? Often genuine intuition will guide you toward something that's not necessarily comfortable or desirable, while fear and wish masquerade as knowing to get you toward comfort or away from perceived threat. Step 3. Trust without proof. This is the hardest part for rational minds. Irrational knowing doesn't come with evidence. It doesn't build a case. It simply knows. And to honor it, you have to act on it before you have rational justification. This feels like insanity to the part of you that's been trained to make evidence-based decisions. But Jung understood that the unconscious has access to information consciousness doesn't, and sometimes you have to trust the knowing before the evidence arrives. Step 4. Act on small knowings first. Don't start by betting your life savings on an intuitive hunch. Start small. You have a knowing that you should call a friend, call them. You have a knowing to take a different route, take it. You have a knowing to read a specific book, read it. Build confidence through small acts of trust and witness the accuracy over time. David did this systematically. He started a knowing journal where he'd record intuitive hits before acting on them, then document what happened. Over months, he accumulated undeniable evidence that his irrational knowing was remarkably accurate. This evidence gave him courage to trust bigger knowings, career decisions, relationship choices, major life moves. Step 5. Witness accuracy over time. Don't expect perfect accuracy. Even genuine intuition can be misinterpreted by the conscious mind. But over time, you'll see patterns. You'll recognize that when you trust a certain kind of knowing, things work out in ways you couldn't have engineered through rational planning. And when you override that knowing with logic, you usually regret it. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." The meeting of rational and irrational knowing in your own psyche is the same. If you allow them to interact, both are transformed. Your rationality becomes wiser, more humble, more open to mystery. Your intuition becomes more grounded, more discerning, more integrated with practical reality. But this requires overcoming the rational mind's resistance, which is fierce, because allowing irrational knowing into your decision-making feels like losing control. And in a sense, it is. You're no longer the sole author of your life, making all decisions through conscious will. You're entering partnership with something larger, the unconscious, the self, the soul, whatever language works for you. And that something has its own intelligence, its own agenda, its own wisdom, that doesn't always align with what your ego thinks you should do. I need to share my own struggle with this shift. I've always been intellectually oriented, trusting analysis and reasoning. When irrational knowing started emerging, my first instinct was to rationalize it, to reverse engineer logical explanations for intuitive hits, to convince myself I was still thinking my way through everything. Because admitting I was knowing things without thinking them felt dangerous. It felt like abandoning the very faculty that made me trust myself. The breaking point came when I ignored a clear, intuitive knowing about a business partnership. Every rational indicator said it was a good idea. The person had credentials, connections, a track record. But I had this knowing, visceral, undeniable, unexplainable, that it was wrong. And I ignored it because I couldn't articulate why. The partnership became one of the most painful experiences of my life, ending exactly how my intuition had warned me it would. After that, I couldn't ignore the knowing anymore. I had to acknowledge that I had access to information through non-rational channels, and that information was as valid, sometimes more valid, than what my reasoning could access. It was humbling for my rational mind, but it was liberating for my soul. The mirror effect with this shift is fascinating. People you judge as too woo-woo or not grounded in reality are often reflecting your own disowned intuitive capacity. The judgment is a defense against acknowledging that you too have access to irrational knowing, that you too can perceive truth through non-rational channels, that maybe the people you've been dismissing as flaky or unscientific are actually fluent in a language you've been refusing to learn. Conversely, people who trigger you by being too rational or closed-minded or stuck in their heads might be reflecting your own fear. Fear that if you fully trust irrational knowing, you'll abandon reason entirely and become unmoored from reality. Fear that you'll make terrible decisions. Fear that you'll lose credibility or be seen as irrational yourself. Both mirrors teach you the integration of rational and irrational knowing doesn't mean abandoning either. It means developing both, trusting both, allowing them to work together rather than forcing them into competition. Here's the warning about this shift. Ego can hijack intuitive knowing and use it for inflation and superiority. My intuition told me can become a way to avoid accountability for bad decisions. I just knew can become a justification for acting without consideration of consequences. The universe guided me can become spiritual bypassing of personal responsibility. Jung warned extensively about psychic inflation when ego identifies with unconscious contents and becomes grandiose. when you start thinking your intuitions are infallible, when you stop questioning your knowings, when you use intuition to justify whatever you want to do anyway, that's ego hijacking the intuitive function. True irrational knowing has a humility to it. It doesn't make you feel special or chosen or superior. It often makes you feel small in the face of how much you don't understand. It reveals that consciousness is just one small flashlight in the vast darkness of the unconscious. And sometimes that darkness offers gifts of knowing your flashlight could never illuminate on its own. David maintained this humility by always holding his intuitions lightly. He'd act on them, but with awareness that he might be misinterpreting. He'd trust them, but not to the exclusion of practical wisdom. He'd honor them, but not to the point of inflation. This kept him grounded while remaining open. Jung said, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good, not only dark but also light, not only bestial, semi-human, and demonic, but superhuman, spiritual, and in the classical sense of the word, divine." The irrational knowing that emerges in this shift is that divine aspect of the unconscious making itself known. It's not random, it's not imagination, it's genuine perception through a channel you've been taught to distrust, but that's been operational your entire life, just beneath conscious awareness. The gift of this shift is profound. You're no longer limited to the information your conscious mind can access. Through rational analysis, you have an ally in the unconscious, feeding you wisdom, warning you of dangers, guiding you toward opportunities that logic alone could never identify. It's like suddenly having access to a GPS system that can see the entire map while your conscious mind was trying to navigate by looking only at what's immediately in front of you. If you're experiencing this shift, if you've noticed irrational knowing emerging in your life, I want you to comment, "Trusting the knowing," below. Because this shift requires courage, the courage to trust what you can't prove, to act on what you can't justify, to honor a form of intelligence that our culture systematically devalues. But Jung devoted his life to rehabilitating irrational knowing, to demonstrating that intuition and feeling are equally valid functions as thinking and sensing. He understood that wholeness requires all four functions working together, and he knew that individuation, the becoming of who you truly are, requires developing your intuitive capacity, especially if you've been over-identified with rationality. The third shift is complete when you can trust irrational knowing without abandoning rational thought, when you can honor intuition without inflating around it, when you can act on knowing that bypasses logic while remaining grounded in practical reality. It's not either or, it's both and. It's the marriage of rational and irrational, conscious and unconscious, ego and self. And that marriage produces a quality of guidance more reliable than either function alone could provide. Your rational mind brings discernment, practicality, and analysis. Your intuitive knowing brings wisdom, foresight, and access to unconscious intelligence. Together, they navigate life with a sophistication neither could achieve independently. David described it perfectly a year after fully integrating this shift. "I used to think being rational meant ignoring my gut. Now I understand that true rationality includes intuition. My gut and my brain work together, and together they make better decisions than either could alone. I'm not less rational now. I'm more completely rational, ratio including all the data, even the data that comes through non-rational channels." That's the mature expression of this shift. Not abandoning reason for mysticism, but expanding reason to include the irrational knowing that's been trying to get your attention all along. Your soul speaks a language your mind wasn't trained to understand, but you're bilingual now. You're learning to translate between conscious and unconscious, between rational and irrational, between the known and the mysteriously known. And that translation opens doors that were always there, but that you couldn't see when you were only looking with your rational eyes. The irrational knowing is your soul's navigation system, and now you're learning to read the compass. The fourth shift that occurs when your soul refuses to stay small is both liberating and devastating. You lose the ability to lie. Not just the ability, the willingness. The mechanism that allowed you to perform, to say what people wanted to hear, to present yourself as something other than what you are, it simply stops functioning. Telling the truth becomes not a choice, but a compulsion, even when, especially when, the truth is inconvenient, costly, or socially catastrophic. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was a nonprofit director, someone who'd built her career on diplomacy, on saying the right thing to the right donor at the right time, on managing relationships with a careful balance of authenticity and strategic presentation. She was exceptional at it. She could walk into a room full of potential funders and leave with commitments, not through manipulation, but through a refined ability to present her organization's work in ways that resonated with each donor's values. And then, during a crucial meeting with their largest funder, everything fell apart. The donor was expressing enthusiasm about expanding a program that Sarah knew in her bones wasn't working. The data looked good on paper, but the actual impact was minimal. The old Sarah would have smiled, expressed gratitude for the donor's vision, and gently steered the conversation toward more effective programs. But something had shifted in her. When the donor asked directly, "Don't you think this program is making a real difference?" Sarah opened her mouth to give the diplomatic answer, and what came out was, "No, honestly, I don't. The metrics we're reporting don't capture what's actually happening on the ground, which is that we're putting resources into something that looks good but doesn't fundamentally change anything for the people we're supposed to serve." The room went silent. The donor's face froze. Sarah's board members looked horrified, and Sarah felt, for the first time in years, like she could breathe. She'd lost the funding. The donor withdrew their support within a week, but she'd gained something she hadn't known she'd been missing: integrity, the alignment of inner truth with outer expression, what Jung called the integration of persona and self. This is the fourth shift in its full, uncompromising force. Your soul, having begun its expansion, now demands complete honesty, not strategic truth, not careful authenticity, but raw, unfiltered, sometimes brutal honesty, and it doesn't care about the consequences. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, but accepting yourself completely requires first admitting what you actually think, feel, believe, want to yourself and to others. And most of us have been lying in small and large ways our entire lives. Polite lies, protective lies, performance lies, lies of omission, lies that maintain relationships, preserve images, avoid conflict, secure resources. After this shift, those lies become physically impossible. Or if you manage to force them out, they leave you feeling contaminated, like you've betrayed something sacred within yourself. The gap between inner truth and outer expression becomes so painful that honoring your truth becomes non-negotiable regardless of cost. Let me break down exactly what changes, because this shift doesn't happen all at once. It's a developmental process, and understanding the stages helps you navigate the social earthquake it creates. Stage 1 is unconscious lying. This is where most of us live most of our lives. We lie habitually, automatically, without even recognizing we're doing it. "I'm fine. That sounds great. I'd love to." "No problem at all." "I completely agree." These automatic responses that maintain social smoothness but bear little relation to our actual experience. We're not being malicious. We're being socially functional, but we're lying nonetheless. Stage 2 is conscious lying. This is when you start noticing the gap between what you're saying and what you're feeling. You can feel the lie as you're telling it. You're aware that you're performing rather than expressing, but you continue doing it because the alternative, radical honesty, seems too risky, too costly, too potentially catastrophic. You know you're lying, but you justify it as necessary. Sarah spent years in this stage. She could feel herself performing in donor meetings, crafting her words for effect rather than truth. But she told herself it was necessary. The cause mattered more than her personal comfort with dishonesty. The people they served needed the funding, so what did it matter if she massaged the truth a little? Stage 3 is lying discomfort. The lies start feeling wrong in your body. You notice that after performing, you feel depleted, contaminated, disconnected from yourself. The social rewards of lying, approval, success, smooth relationships, stop outweighing the internal cost. You start minimizing the lying, testing small truths in safe spaces, watching what happens when you're honest. Stage 4 is selective truth. You become authentic in relationships and spaces that feel safe while maintaining performance in high-stakes situations. You tell the truth to friends but lie to bosses. You're honest with your partner but perform for your parents. You're selective, strategic, protecting yourself while beginning to honor your truth where possible. Stage 5 is compulsive truth. This is where Sarah landed, and it's where this shift completes itself. The ability to lie, even strategically, evaporates. You cannot make yourself say what isn't true, even when the truth will cost you. The words simply won't come out, or if you force them, you feel such internal distress that it's not sustainable. Your soul has drawn a line. No more lies, regardless of consequence. Stage 6 is skillful truth. This is the mature expression of this shift. And it's important because compulsive truth without wisdom can become its own form of violence. Skillful truth means you tell the truth, but you've learned to do so with compassion, timing, and awareness of impact. You're not using honesty as a weapon or hiding cruelty behind just being authentic. You're speaking your truth in ways that honor both your integrity and others' humanity. Jung understood this progression intimately. His concept of individuation requires what he called the withdrawal of projections, seeing yourself and others clearly, rather than through the distortions of ego defense and social performance. But that seeing requires honesty. Brutal, uncomfortable, sometimes socially catastrophic honesty. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But that understanding requires admitting what actually irritates us, what we actually feel, what we actually believe, not what we think we should feel or believe. And in a culture built on performance and politeness, such honesty is revolutionary." Let me be specific about what becomes impossible after this shift, because understanding the scope helps you prepare for the consequences. First, polite lies become unbearable. How are you? I'm great. When you're actually struggling, that's wonderful. When you actually think it's misguided, I'd love to help. When you actually need to protect your energy, these automatic social lubricants stop flowing. People ask how you are, and you tell them, truly tell them. This makes people deeply uncomfortable because no one actually wants the real answer to, how are you? Second, authentic opinions emerge unfiltered. Someone shows you their work, and instead of the automatic, "This is amazing," you share your honest response, which might include critique, questions, or lack of enthusiasm. Someone asks for your political opinion, and you share it, even knowing it might create conflict. You stop performing agreement to maintain social harmony. Third, secrets feel toxic. Things you used to hold privately, doubts, struggles, unconventional beliefs, parts of your story you kept hidden. These start demanding expression, not because you want attention, but because holding them feels like slowly poisoning yourself. The energy required to maintain secrets becomes unbearable. Sarah found that after her shift, she couldn't maintain the careful separation between her public persona and private self. She started talking openly about her struggles with depression. She shared her doubts about nonprofit work's actual efficacy. She admitted when she didn't know something rather than performing expertise. And while it cost her professionally in some ways, people found her less professional, less polished. It connected her with people in ways performance never had. Fourth, performing enthusiasm becomes physically exhausting. You're invited to an event you don't want to attend, and you cannot make yourself sound excited about it. You're asked to do something that doesn't align with your truth, and you cannot generate the false enthusiasm that makes the ask easier for everyone. Your body simply won't produce the performance anymore. Fifth, speaking your truth becomes non-negotiable, even at cost. This is the most dramatic manifestation. You're in a job interview and you tell them about your struggles rather than presenting your highlight reel. You're on a date and you're honest about your fears and doubts rather than performing confidence. You're with family and you set boundaries rather than maintaining peace through compliance. The truth matters more than the outcome. Jung wrote about this as the development of the authentic self in relationship to the self with a capital S, the totality of who you are. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become who you truly are while lying about who you are. The lies, even polite ones, even strategic ones, create a gap between your experienced self and your expressed self. And that gap is where the soul gets trapped. Compulsive truth-telling closes that gap. It forces alignment between inner and outer, between experienced and expressed, between who you are in your private depths and who you present to the world. And that alignment, while socially costly, is spiritually essential. But let me be honest about the cost, because this shift creates a relational earthquake. Relationships built on your performance cannot survive your truth. Sarah lost funding. She also lost board members who were uncomfortable with her new directness. She lost professional relationships that had been built on strategic image management. She lost her reputation as diplomatic and easy to work with. For months, she grieved these losses, because even though those relationships required performance, they were still relationships. Even though that funding came with strings of dishonesty, it still sustained work she cared about. Even though her reputation was based on a persona, it still opened doors. The losses were real. The grief was legitimate. This is what I call the truth-telling crucible, the period after you can no longer lie, but before you've built relationships and structures that can hold your truth. It's lonely, it's scary, it's financially and socially precarious. You've burned the boats of your old life, but the new life hasn't solidified yet. You're suspended between who you were and who you're becoming, surviving on integrity alone. Jung spent years in this crucible after his break with Freud. He lost professional standing, relationships, certainty about his career. He descended into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological work that he later recognized as essential to his individuation, but that felt, at the time, like total collapse. He wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The descent into compulsive truth-telling, into refusing all performance, is that descent to hell, necessary but terrifying. Here's what I need to share vulnerably. I lost a friendship of 15 years to this shift. My friend asked me to support them in something I fundamentally disagreed with. The old me would have found a diplomatic way to express concern while still being supportive. But I was in the compulsive truth stage. I told them directly, "I think this decision is going to harm you, and I can't pretend to support it." They felt betrayed. They felt judged. They felt like I was abandoning them when they needed support. And from their perspective, Maybe I was. But I literally could not make my mouth say words of support for something I believed was destructive. The mechanism that would have allowed that performance was gone. The friendship ended, and I grieved it deeply, while simultaneously knowing I couldn't have chosen differently without betraying something essential in myself. The mirror effect with this shift is profound. People you judge as too honest or brutally blunt or lacking social grace. They're reflecting your own suppressed truth. The judgment is defensive. If you acknowledge that their honesty is actually integrity, you have to confront how much you're still lying, how much you're still performing, how much you're still choosing social acceptance over authentic expression. Conversely, people who trigger you by being fake or two-faced or phony, they're reflecting your own history of performance, maybe your current performance that you're still not ready to admit to yourself. The trigger is showing you something about your relationship with truth and lies, authenticity and performance. And here's the critical warning about this shift. Truth-telling can become a weapon if you're not careful. You can use "I'm just being honest" to justify cruelty. You can hide aggression behind authenticity. You can weaponize your truth in ways that are actually about control or revenge, not integrity. Jung warned about this explicitly. He said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." If you're using truth-telling to feel superior, to hurt people, to prove you're more evolved or conscious or brave, that's shadow material masquerading as integrity. Skillful truth, the mature expression of this shift, requires deep self-examination. You ask yourself, is this truth necessary? Is this the right time and context? Am I speaking this truth with compassion, or am I using it to wound? Is this about my integrity, or is this about my ego wanting to be seen as authentic? Sarah learned this the hard way. After losing the funding through her compulsive honesty, she went through a period where she was honest to the point of aggression. She told people hard truths they hadn't asked for. She shared her opinions when silence would have been wiser. She confused authentic expression with unfiltered expression, not yet understanding that discretion and integrity aren't opposites. It wasn't until a colleague said to her, "Your honesty is starting to feel like violence. You're not sharing truth anymore. You're using truth as a hammer," that Sarah recognized her shadow in the shift. She'd become inflated around her authenticity, using it to feel superior to people she judged as still performing. Her honesty had become its own form of performance. Look how brave I am, how willing to tell hard truths, how evolved beyond polite lies. This recognition was devastating and necessary. It moved her from compulsive truth to skillful truth. She remained committed to honesty, but she integrated wisdom, compassion, and timing. She learned that silence is sometimes the most honest response, that "I'm not ready to share that yet" is more authentic than forced disclosure, that truth-telling serves integrity, not ego. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." In skillful truth-telling, you're meeting others authentically, which means you're open to being transformed by the encounter, not just delivering your truth and remaining unchanged. You're in dialogue, not monologue. You're in relationship, not performance, even performance of authenticity. Let me give you a framework for navigating this shift with integrity, what I call the truthful speech practice. First, check your motivation. Before speaking a difficult truth, pause and ask yourself, why am I saying this? Is it to maintain my own integrity, to genuinely serve this person or situation, or is it to feel superior, to punish, to prove something about myself? Your motivation determines whether truth-telling is integrity or aggression. Second, consider timing and context. Some truths are true but premature. Some truths are true but not yours to tell. Some truths are true but need the right container to be received. Just because something is true doesn't mean it needs to be said right now by you in this way. Skillful truth includes wise timing. Third, speak from I, not you. I feel uncomfortable with this is authentic. Your being fake is judgment. I don't agree with this approach maintains your integrity. Your wrong is attack disguised as honesty. Skillful truth speaks your experience without making definitive claims about others' internal states or worth. Fourth, stay open to response. Authentic truth-telling isn't about being right. It's about being real, which means when you share your truth, you remain open to hearing others' truth, even when it challenges yours, even when it reveals your blind spots. The goal isn't winning through honesty. It's mutual, deeper understanding through authentic exchange. Fifth, honor silence when appropriate. Not every thought needs expression. Not every truth needs an audience. Sometimes the most authentic response is simply holding your truth internally, allowing it to inform your actions without requiring verbal expression. Skillful truth includes knowing when to speak and when to simply be true within yourself. Sarah integrated all of this over time. 2 years after her compulsive truth-telling began, she described her relationship with honesty this way. I can't lie anymore, but I've learned that honesty doesn't mean saying everything I think. It means being in integrity, which sometimes looks like speaking hard truths, and sometimes looks like compassionate silence. The common thread is that I'm not performing. I'm not saying what people want to hear. I'm in authentic relationship with myself and with others, and that relationship guides what I share and when. That's the mature expression of this fourth shift, not the weaponized honesty of early stages, but the integrated authenticity of someone who's learned that truth-telling is an art requiring both courage and wisdom. Jung said, "Everything good is costly, and the development of personality is one of the most costly of all things. Compulsive truth-telling is costly. It costs relationships, opportunities, social ease, professional advancement. But what it gives you is priceless. Integrity. The alignment of who you are inside with who you are outside. The relief of no longer maintaining the exhausting gap between performed and actual self. And here's what happens on the other side of the crucible. The relationships that form after this shift are so much deeper, more real, more nourishing than what performance ever created, because they're based on your actual self, not your performed self. People are loving and connecting with who you actually are, not who you're pretending to be, which means the acceptance is real, the love is real, the connection is real. Sarah eventually found funders who valued her directness. She built a board that appreciated honest dialogue over diplomatic performance. She formed friendships based on mutual authenticity rather than careful image management. She created a life where she could breathe, where she didn't have to monitor every word for strategic effect, where she could simply be herself and trust that was enough. The relationships were fewer. The professional path was less conventional. The social ease was gone. But the integrity was absolute. And that integrity created a foundation nothing could shake, because it was built on truth rather than performance. If you're experiencing this shift right now, if you've discovered you can no longer lie, even when lying would be more convenient, I want you to comment compulsive truth below, because you need to know you're not alone in this. You're not being difficult or antisocial or professionally self-sabotaging. Your soul is demanding alignment. Your psyche is refusing to maintain the split between inner and outer anymore. And while it's costly, it's also sacred. Jung devoted his life to helping people become whole, individuated, and you cannot individuate while lying about who you are. The performance, no matter how sophisticated, keeps you fragmented. The truth, no matter how costly, moves you toward wholeness. This fourth shift completes when you can speak your truth with both courage and compassion, when you can be honest without being cruel, when you can maintain your integrity while honoring others' humanity. It's not about being right. It's not about winning. It's not about proving your evolution. It's about living in alignment, about closing the gap between who you are and who you present yourself to be, about trusting that your authentic self, messy, imperfect, still evolving, is worthy of being seen, known, and connected with. The lies die so the truth can live. And the truth, despite all its costs, will set you free in ways performance never could. Your soul has spoken. It will tolerate lies no longer, and learning to honor that demand, to speak your truth skillfully and wisely, to live in integrity even when it costs everything. That's the work of this shift. The truth-telling isn't optional anymore, but how you tell the truth, how you integrate honesty with wisdom, that's where your consciousness gets to participate. Welcome to the liberation of compulsive truth. It's more costly and more freeing than you ever imagined it could be. The fifth shift that occurs when your soul expands is one of the most mystical and undeniable. Time starts behaving strangely, and meaningful coincidences multiply exponentially. Events that should take months happen in days. Connections that should be random prove impossibly perfect. The universe, or the unconscious, or whatever you want to call the intelligence that orchestrates reality, begins responding to your internal shifts with external manifestations so precise they feel like proof you're living in an animate, conscious cosmos. Let me tell you about Michael. He was a photographer who'd spent 5 years trying to break into fine art galleries, sending portfolios, networking strategically, doing everything right according to industry wisdom. Nothing worked. Doors stayed closed. Opportunities remained out of reach. He was talented, but so were thousands of others, and the pathway from talented unknown to recognized artist seemed impenetrable. And then he made a decision that changed everything, not a strategic decision, but a soul decision. He stopped trying to create work that galleries would want and started creating work that expressed his actual vision, even though that vision was darker, stranger, more personal than what seemed marketable. Within 2 weeks of making this shift internally, before he'd even finished a new series, 3 things happened that defy probability. First, he ran into a curator he'd been trying to connect with for years, at a coffee shop neither of them regularly frequented, at 6:30 in the morning, both there because they'd randomly decided to go somewhere different that day. Second, that curator mentioned she was looking for work on the exact theme Michael's new series explored. Third, when Michael showed her the preliminary shots on his phone, she offered him a show on the spot, and mentioned that their originally scheduled artist had canceled that very morning, leaving an opening in 3 months. Michael described it to me like this: "It was like the universe had been waiting for me to get out of my own way. The moment I stopped trying to force success through strategy and started creating from soul alignment, reality itself rearranged to support me. Doors that had been locked for years swung open effortlessly. People I needed appeared exactly when I needed them. Timing that should have been impossible became perfect. It wasn't luck. It was something else entirely, like I'd finally tuned to the right frequency and the signal could get through." This is what Jung called synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that cannot be explained by causation. He defined it as the simultaneous occurrence of 2 meaningfully but not causally connected events, and spent decades trying to understand its mechanism. Unlike causation, where one event causes another, synchronicity reveals a causal connecting principle, meaning arising from the meaningful connection between inner psychological state and outer physical events. Jung wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." But most people don't have eyes to see because they're operating at a frequency where synchronicity, while still occurring, isn't dramatically visible. When your soul expands, when you begin living in alignment with your authentic self, that frequency shifts, and suddenly you're operating in what feels like a different reality, one where meaningful coincidence is commonplace, where impossible timing becomes normal, where the universe seems to be in active dialogue with your psyche. Let me break down the phenomena that characterize this shift, because understanding them helps you recognize synchronicity when it occurs and respond to it appropriately. First, perfect timing of events. Things happen at exactly the right moment in ways that logical planning couldn't orchestrate. You need specific information, and a book literally falls off a shelf in front of you, that exact book. You're struggling with a decision, and a stranger's overheard conversation speaks directly to your situation. You're about to give up on something, and encouragement arrives from an unexpected source at the precise moment you need it. Michael experienced this constantly after his shift. He'd think about needing a specific type of location for a shoot, and within hours someone would mention that exact location. He'd worry about a technical challenge, and he'd run into someone who had expertise in exactly that area. The timing stopped being mere coincidence and started being conversation, like reality was responding to his needs. Second, people appearing with needed resources, not through networking or strategy, but through chance encounters that prove anything but random. You think about someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they contact you that day with exactly what you need. You meet someone randomly who has the precise skill, connection, or information your current situation requires. The right people show up at the right time, as if guided by intelligence beyond your conscious orchestration. Third, books and messages arriving at exact right moment. You're wrestling with a question, and a friend gifts you a book that addresses it specifically. You're in a bookstore, and your hand reaches for a volume that turns out to contain exactly the perspective you needed. You scroll social media mindlessly, and a post appears with information directly relevant to your situation. The mechanism that delivers what you need when you need it becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Fourth, dreams previewing real events. Your unconscious starts showing you what's coming before it arrives in external reality. You dream about a specific person, and they contact you the next day. You dream about a challenge, and it manifests within the week, but you're prepared because the dream gave you preview. Your dream life and waking life begin bleeding into each other, connected by meaning rather than causation. Fifth, thinking of someone who immediately contacts you. This happens so frequently after the shift that it becomes unremarkable. You think of someone, truly think of them, not just casual remembering, and your phone rings, or they text, or you run into them, often within hours or even minutes. The boundaries between your psyche and external reality seem permeable in ways that defy materialist understanding of how the world works. Sixth, obstacles dissolving mysteriously. You face a problem that seems insurmountable, and suddenly it resolves itself through means you couldn't have anticipated or engineered. A person who was blocking your path moves on. A situation that seemed permanent shifts. Resources appear, solutions emerge, not through your effort, but through what appears to be reality itself, rearranging to allow your soul-aligned path forward. Jung explored the mechanism of synchronicity extensively, ultimately concluding that it reveals something fundamental about the relationship between psyche and matter. He wrote, "We are so accustomed to the apparently rational nature of our world that we can scarcely imagine anything happening that cannot be explained on rational grounds. However, the truly unique nature of every individual comes to light only when he begins to descend into his own depths. As his path toward wholeness unfolds, the unconscious is in some way or other able to cross the frontiers of physical space and time. Let me give you the synchronicity amplification process, how this shift intensifies and what allows it to function most powerfully. Stage 1 is soul alignment. Synchronicity accelerates dramatically when you're living authentically rather than performing, when there's alignment between your inner truth and outer expression. When you've made soul-aligned decisions, even at cost, the synchronistic field becomes more active. It's as if reality itself responds to integrity, to authenticity, to the courage to live from your actual self rather than your strategic self. Michael noticed this immediately. Years of strategic career moves produced minimal synchronicity, one authentic decision, creating from soul rather than marketability, and synchronicities exploded. This isn't superstition, it's observable pattern. Soul alignment amplifies synchronicity. Stage 2 is increased noticing. Once you start paying attention, you realize synchronicity has always been occurring. You just weren't seeing it. Most people dismiss meaningful coincidence as random chance because acknowledging it would require revising their entire worldview. But when your soul expands, you start noticing the patterns, the connections, the impossible timing, and noticing itself seems to amplify the phenomenon. Stage 3 is trust response. This is crucial. Synchronicity requires response. When you notice a meaningful coincidence and act on it, follow the lead, make the call, accept the invitation, trust the timing. You're engaging in dialogue with whatever intelligence is orchestrating these events. And that engagement amplifies future synchronicity. It's a feedback loop. Reality offers a synchronistic opening. You trust and respond to it. Reality offers more. Michael learned to trust synchronistic leads absolutely. When he'd think of someone and they'd contact him, he'd respond immediately rather than waiting. When he'd have an urge to go somewhere and would randomly meet exactly who he needed to meet, he started trusting those urges as guidance. The more he trusted and responded, the more precise and frequent the synchronicities became. Stage 4 is energy feedback loop. The relationship between inner psychological state and outer synchronistic events creates a positive feedback cycle. Soul alignment produces synchronicity. Synchronicity validates soul alignment. That validation strengthens your capacity to stay aligned even when it's difficult, which produces more synchronicity. The loop accelerates your individuation process exponentially. But here's what's crucial to understand. Synchronicity isn't magic you can control or manipulate. It's not the law of attraction where thinking positive thoughts manifests parking spaces. Jung was very clear about this. Synchronicity reveals a causal connecting principle, meaning that connects psyche and matter in ways we don't fully understand. It's not about controlling external reality through internal state. It's about recognizing that internal and external aren't as separate as materialist worldview suggests. Jung wrote, "Synchronicity takes the coincidence of events in space and time as meaning something more than mere chance, namely a peculiar interdependence of objective events among themselves as well as with the subjective, psychic states of the observer or observers. The observer isn't creating the events through thought, but there's a meaningful relationship between the observer's psychological state and the events that occur, a relationship mediated by meaning rather than causation. This is where people go off the rails with synchronicity. They start thinking they can manifest specific outcomes through visualization or positive thinking. They turn synchronicity into another form of magical thinking where you're supposed to control reality through your consciousness. But that's ego hijacking a sacred phenomenon and using it for personal power. True synchronicity has a quality of grace to it. It feels like gift, not accomplishment. It surprises you. It humbles you. It makes you feel small in the face of an intelligence far vaster than your conscious mind. Michael described it perfectly. Every synchronicity reminds me that I'm not in charge. Something is orchestrating events with an intelligence I can't comprehend and a timing I couldn't engineer if I tried. It's humbling. It makes me feel held by something larger than myself. That's the right relationship to synchronicity, not as tool for personal manifestation, but as evidence of intelligence, meaning, and connection beyond what rational materialism can explain. It doesn't make you powerful. It makes you aware of how much power exists beyond your conscious control, and how that power sometimes aligns with your soul's trajectory in ways that feel like love. I need to share my own most profound synchronistic experience because it illustrates both the phenomenon and the right relationship to it. I was going through the darkest period of my life, lost, alone, questioning everything about my path and purpose. One morning, desperate for guidance, I asked out loud, to whom or what I didn't know. Please show me I'm not alone in this. Please give me a sign that this path makes sense. Within an hour, I received an email from someone I'd never met who lived in another country. They'd somehow found an essay I'd written years ago that I'd forgotten about, and they wrote, "I don't know if you'll even see this, but I had to reach out. This piece you wrote saved my life at my darkest moment. It showed me I wasn't alone. Thank you for walking this path, even when it must be so difficult." The essay they referenced was about the exact struggle I was in that morning. The timing was impossible. The message was exactly what I'd asked for, in words I couldn't have scripted more perfectly. I didn't manifest that. I didn't control it. It was grace. It was synchronicity showing me I was held, guided, part of something larger. And it changed me, not by making me feel powerful, but by making me feel connected to an intelligence that could orchestrate such impossible timing and meaning. The mirror effect with this shift is fascinating. People who trigger you by believing in coincidences or seeing patterns everywhere might be reflecting your own fear of living in an animated universe, because if you acknowledge synchronicity as real, you have to revise your entire worldview. You have to admit that materialism might not explain all of reality, that consciousness and matter might be connected in ways science hasn't accounted for, that you might be living in a universe that's responsive, meaningful, intelligent in ways that are simultaneously terrifying and beautiful. Conversely, people who dismiss synchronicity as woo-woo or magical thinking might be reflecting your own need for control. If synchronicity is real, then you're not in charge. You can't engineer all outcomes. You're participating in something larger than your conscious will. And for ego, that's threatening. Here's the warning about this shift. Synchronicity can become another ego game if you're not careful. You can start seeing signs everywhere, using synchronicity to justify whatever you want to do anyway. You can become inflated, thinking the universe is specially orchestrating events for you because you're chosen or special. You can use synchronistic thinking to avoid taking responsibility for your choices. The universe made it happen. Jung warned about this explicitly. He said psychic inflation, when ego identifies with unconscious contents, is one of the great dangers of individuation. When you start thinking every coincidence is cosmic guidance meant specially for you, when you stop using discernment about which events are truly synchronistic and which are just coincidences, when you use synchronicity to feel special rather than held, that's inflation. True synchronicity has humility built into it. You don't control it. You can't predict it. You can't make it happen on demand. It arrives as gift, speaks its meaning, and leaves you awed rather than inflated. Michael maintained this humility by never taking synchronicity for granted. Every meaningful coincidence surprised him, gratefuled him, reminded him of his smallness in the face of something vast. and he learned to discern. Not every coincidence is synchronistic. Not every event that happens after you think about something is caused by your thinking. Jung was clear that synchronicity is recognizable by its quality of meaning, the relationship between the inner psychological state and the external event creates a meaning that couldn't exist if either element were absent. It's the meaning that makes it synchronistic, not just the timing. The mature expression of this shift is what Jung called living in relationship with the self being the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, personal and collective. When you're in right relationship with the self, synchronicity becomes a language of dialogue between your conscious intentions and the unconscious orchestration of events. You don't control it. You participate in it. You trust it without demanding it. You notice it without inflating around it. Michael described his relationship with synchronicity this way. I don't expect the universe to rescue me or engineer every detail of my life, but I pay attention. I notice when timing feels too perfect, when people appear with exactly what I need, when obstacles dissolve mysteriously, and when I notice these moments, I respond. I follow the lead. I trust the timing. I say yes to the opening. Not because I think I'm special, but because I'm learning to dance with something larger than myself. And that dance has become my most reliable guidance system. That's the gift of this shift. Not control over reality, but partnership with it. Not manifestation of your ego's desires, but alignment with your soul's trajectory. Not proof that you're special, but evidence that you're held by an intelligence that orchestrates meaning in ways consciousness alone could never engineer. If you're experiencing this shift, if you've noticed synchronicity accelerating in your life, if time seems to be collapsing and meaningful coincidences multiplying, I want you to comment "Dancing with Synchronicity" below. Because this shift is your confirmation that soul alignment matters, that when you live authentically, when you honor your truth, when you make soul-aligned decisions, even at cost, reality itself responds. Jung spent his entire career trying to understand this phenomenon. He collaborated with physicist Wolfgang Pauli, exploring whether synchronicity revealed something fundamental about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. He documented hundreds of synchronistic events in his own life and his patients' lives. He developed the concept precisely because the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss, even though it challenged everything rational materialism taught about how the world works. He wrote, "Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Its true life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. The part that appears above the ground lasts only a single summer. Then it withers away, an ephemeral apparition. When we think of the unending growth and decay of life and civilizations, we cannot escape the impression of absolute nullity. Yet I have never lost the sense of something that lives and endures beneath the eternal flux. What we see is blossom, which passes. The rhizome remains. Synchronicity is evidence of that rhizome, the invisible intelligence beneath the visible events, the connection between all things that exists beyond causation, the meaning that flows through reality like water through roots. When your soul expands, you don't create that rhizome. You become more conscious of it, more sensitive to it, more capable of recognizing when the invisible intelligence is speaking through the visible events. And here's the deepest truth about this shift. Synchronicity doesn't happen to you. It happens through you. You're not a passive recipient of cosmic coincidences. You're an active participant in the creation of meaning. Your psychological state, your soul alignment, your authentic expression, these create conditions where synchronicity can manifest, not because you're controlling external reality, but because you're participating in the unified field where psyche and matter are aspects of the same underlying reality. Michael realized this after years of working with synchronicity. He said, "I used to think synchronicity was something the universe did for me, like cosmic customer service. Now I understand that I'm part of the mechanism. When I'm in soul alignment, I'm literally changing the field I'm operating in. I'm not separate from reality, observing it and occasionally getting lucky coincidences. I'm part of reality, and my internal state affects the larger pattern the way a string being plucked affects the whole instrument. Synchronicity isn't magic, it's physics we don't understand yet." That's a profound insight. Jung hinted at this when he explored what he called the unus mundus, the unified reality underlying the apparent separation between psyche and matter, subject and object, internal and external. He believed synchronicity gave us glimpses of that unified reality, moments when the veil between inner and outer became thin enough to see through. The practical implication is revolutionary. You're not helpless in a mechanical universe, buffeted by random events, but you're also not controlling reality through manifestation techniques. You're participating in an intelligent, meaningful, responsive universe where your authentic expression creates ripples that affect the larger pattern. Soul alignment matters not because it makes you powerful, but because it aligns you with the deeper current, the rhizome, the intelligence that's been orchestrating meaningful events all along. Let me give you practical guidance for working with this shift skillfully, what I call the synchronicity response framework. First, notice without grasping. When synchronicity occurs, acknowledge it. Feel the awe of it. Recognize the meaning, but don't try to force more synchronicities to happen through that recognition. Grasping kills the phenomenon, noticing nourishes it. There's a difference between "I see this meaningful coincidence, I'm grateful," and "I must make more meaningful coincidences happen by trying really hard to manifest them." The first is participation. The second is control, and it doesn't work. Second, respond with trust. When a synchronicity opens a door, walk through it, even when you don't understand where it leads. When a meaningful coincidence offers a connection, make the call. When impossible timing creates an opportunity, take it. Your response is part of the dialogue. The universe, or the self, or however you conceptualize the intelligence behind synchronicity, is offering something. Your willingness to receive and respond keeps the channel open. Third, maintain humility. Every synchronicity is a reminder that you're not in charge. Something larger, wiser, more patient than your conscious ego is orchestrating timing and connections you couldn't engineer. Let that humble you. Let it make you feel small in the best way, held by something vast, participating in intelligence beyond your comprehension. Fourth, don't force meaning. Not every coincidence is synchronistic. Not every event that follows your thoughts is caused by those thoughts. Jung gave us clear criteria. Synchronicity involves meaningful, not just temporal connection between inner psychological state and outer event. And that meaning must be significant enough to rule out probability. If you have to force the interpretation, it's probably not synchronicity. True synchronicity hits you with its, meaning. You don't have to convince yourself. Fifth, integrate rather than inflate. Use synchronistic experiences to deepen your relationship with the unconscious, with the self, with the mysterious intelligence underlying reality. Don't use them to feel special, chosen, or superior to people who don't notice synchronicity. The phenomenon is available to everyone. You're just becoming more conscious of it. That's development, not election. Michael integrated all of this beautifully. When synchronicities occurred, he acknowledged them in his journal, staying with the feeling of connection and awe they created. He responded to the openings they offered, following leads that made no rational sense but felt synchronistically significant. He maintained humility, never assuming he could force or control the phenomenon. He discerned carefully, not treating every coincidence as cosmic guidance. And he used the experiences to deepen his trust in the larger intelligence guiding his individuation. The result was a life that felt increasingly aligned, supported, guided, not in the sense that everything became easy, but in the sense that even the difficulties felt meaningful, part of a larger pattern he was learning to trust, even when he didn't understand it. Jung wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Synchronicity is the universe's way of reminding you that meaning is real, that your life is woven into a larger pattern, that the connections between all things aren't just causal, but meaningful. And when you're living in soul alignment, when you've made the shifts we've been exploring, death of false self, intolerance for superficiality, emergence of irrational knowing, compulsive truth-telling, you become more permeable to that meaning, more capable of recognizing when the larger pattern is making itself visible through impossible timing and meaningful coincidence. This fifth shift is complete when you can live in partnership with synchronicity, noticing it, responding to it, trusting it, being humbled by it, without trying to control it, without inflating around it, without using it to bypass personal responsibility. When you understand that you're not separate from the intelligence orchestrating meaningful events, but you're also not in control of it. When you can hold the paradox that you're both participating in creating your reality and being guided by something far larger than your conscious will. Michael described this mature relationship perfectly. "I used to want certainty, to know exactly where my life was going, to control all the variables, to engineer successful outcomes. Now I have something better than certainty. I have trust. Trust that when I'm in soul alignment, the right doors open, the right people appear. The timing works out in ways I couldn't plan. I'm not passive. I'm actively creating, working, showing up, but I'm doing it in partnership with something that's orchestrating connections and timing beyond what I could manage alone. And that partnership feels more reliable than control ever did." That's the promise of this shift. Not control over reality, not the ability to manifest whatever you want, but the profound relief of discovering you're not alone in navigating your life, that there's an intelligence, call it the unconscious, the self, the universe, God, whatever language works for you, that's been orchestrating meaningful events all along, waiting for you to become conscious enough to recognize its language. The time collapses because you're no longer swimming against the current, trying to force outcomes through sheer will. You're aligning with the deeper current, and it moves faster than ego effort ever could. The synchronicities accelerate because you're becoming fluent in the language the unconscious has been speaking all along. You're learning to read the signs, trust the timing, follow the leads that reality keeps offering you, and gradually, impossibly, your life starts to feel less like something you're doing and more like something you're becoming, not through passivity, but through active partnership with the intelligence that knows you better than you know yourself. The intelligence that's been trying to guide you toward wholeness all along, using the only language that crosses the boundary between inner and outer, psychological and physical, subjective and objective. Synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, the universe's way of confirming that you're on the right path. Welcome to the dialogue. Reality has been waiting for you to learn its language, and now, finally, you're becoming fluent. The fifth shift opens a door to living in an animated, meaningful, responsive universe. And once you've walked through that door, once you've seen that meaning is woven into the fabric of reality itself, there's no going back to the flat, mechanical worldview that says everything is random and nothing matters. You're awake to the rhizome now, and it changes everything. The sixth shift that occurs when your soul refuses to stay small is sudden, non-negotiable, and socially explosive. You develop fierce consciousness about what drains your energy, and you become ruthlessly protective of your soul's space. People, situations, obligations, and dynamics that you once tolerated or even participated in become impossible to endure, and the guilt that used to accompany saying no, that guilt evaporates, replaced by clear, calm certainty that protecting your energy isn't selfish, it's sacred. Let me tell you about Rachel. She was the family peacemaker, the friend everyone called in crisis, the colleague who always said yes to extra projects. For 38 years, her identity was built on being available, helpful, needed. She was a lifelong people pleaser, and she was exceptional at it. She could sense what people needed before they asked and provide it before they even knew they wanted it. Her entire worth structure was built on being the one people could count on, the reliable one, the one who never said no. And then something shifted. It started small, a phone call from a friend who only ever called to complain. And Rachel looked at the ringing phone and thought clearly, I don't want to answer this, not I shouldn't answer this, not I should want to help, but I'm too tired. Just simple, clear, I don't want to. And for the first time in her life, she didn't answer. She let it go to voicemail, and she felt nothing. No guilt, no anxiety, just relief. That was the beginning. Within months, Rachel's entire relationship to her time, energy, and availability transformed. She stopped volunteering for every committee at her kids' school. She stopped being the one who hosted every holiday because everyone expects it. She stopped answering texts immediately, stopped explaining her no's, stopped accommodating people who consistently took more than they gave. And the people in her life were shocked, because reliable, available, people-pleasing Rachel had apparently been replaced by someone with boundaries, and they didn't know how to relate to this new version. She described it to me like this. It was like I could suddenly see energy as a tangible resource. I could see where it was going, who was draining it, which activities were replenishing it, which obligations were leaking it. And I realized I'd been operating at a deficit for decades, giving away energy to people and things that didn't nourish me, and then wondering why I was always exhausted. The moment I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. And I couldn't keep giving my energy away just because people expected it. My soul required that energy for its expansion, and protecting that became more important than being liked. This is what Jung called the emergence of the self's protective function, the psyche defending its own integrity and wholeness. Jung understood that individuation requires energy, massive amounts of psychic energy, and that energy has to come from somewhere. When you've been leaking energy through weak boundaries, through over-giving, through accommodating others at the cost of yourself, there's not enough energy left for the soul's expansion. So the psyche, in its wisdom, forcibly reclaims that energy. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires the energy to do that work. And if you're spending all your energy maintaining relationships, meeting others' expectations, and avoiding disappointing people, there's nothing left for your own becoming. This sixth shift is the psyche saying, no more. This energy is mine. This space is mine. This life is mine. And I will protect it. Let me break down exactly what becomes clear and non-negotiable after this shift, because understanding it helps you navigate the social earthquake it creates. First, energy vampires are no longer tolerated. These are people who consistently take more than they give, who leave you feeling drained after every interaction, who treat your energy and time as unlimited resources for their needs. Before the shift, you accommodated them out of guilt, obligation, or the belief that you should be able to help everyone. After the shift, your body rejects them like poison. You can feel the drain happening in real time, and you simply cannot make yourself tolerate it anymore. Second, over-giving stops abruptly. You've been the one who gives 80% while others give 20%, who does emotional labor for everyone, who carries the weight of others' feelings and needs. After the shift, you stop, not gradually, not with explanation, not with apology, just stop. You give what feels genuinely aligned, and when you hit your limit, you stop. No negotiation, no guilt, just clear boundaries around your capacity. Third, guilt about boundaries disappears. This is perhaps the most shocking aspect for lifelong people-pleasers. The guilt that used to accompany every no, that used to make you justify and explain and apologize for having limits, it evaporates. You say no and you feel good, clear, aligned. The internal voice that used to scream you're being selfish gets replaced with you're being wise. The shift from guilt to clarity is absolute and irreversible. Fourth, your time and space become sacred. You start treating your schedule, your home, your solitude as precious resources that require protection. People can no longer drop by unannounced. You no longer say yes to invitations out of obligation. You create containers around your time that honor what you actually need rather than what others expect. And you defend those containers fiercely. Fifth, others' opinions lose power. Before the shift, the threat of disappointing people or being judged by them could make you override your own needs. After the shift, that threat becomes irrelevant. Someone is upset you set a boundary. That's their work, not yours. Someone thinks you're selfish for protecting your energy. Their opinion doesn't change your clarity. The external validation that used to govern your choices loses its grip entirely. Sixth, saying no feels good rather than guilty. This is the emotional signature of integrated boundaries. Saying no creates relief and alignment rather than anxiety and guilt. It means you're honoring yourself. It means you're in integrity. It means you're living from soul truth rather than performed accommodation. And that feels better than any approval ever did. Jung understood this as essential to individuation. He wrote, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm which is not easily disturbed." The conflict between your soul's need for protected space and others' expectations of your availability, this is one of those intense conflicts. And overcoming it by choosing your soul over their expectations produces that unshakable security Jung spoke of. Let me give you the boundary transformation map, because this shift happens in stages, and recognizing where you are helps you trust the process. Stage 1 is boundaryless. This is where Rachel lived for decades. You're merged with others' needs, unable to distinguish between what's yours and what's theirs. You feel responsible for everyone's feelings, problems, and happiness. Saying no feels impossible because you can't separate their disappointment from your own failure. You're operating without clear edges, absorbing everything around you. Stage 2 is boundary awareness. You start noticing violations. Someone asks you to do something and you notice the internal resistance, the resentment, the sense that this isn't fair or right. You don't act on this awareness yet. You still say yes, but you're starting to see the cost of your boundarylessness. You're starting to recognize that you have limits, needs, preferences that differ from what others want from you. Stage 3 is boundary attempts. You try to set boundaries, but tentatively, with apology, with justification. "I'm sorry, I can't this time," because you're still seeking permission for your boundaries, still trying to make them palatable to others. The boundaries are weak because you haven't fully claimed your right to have them. You're testing whether it's safe to have edges. Stage 4 is guilt period. You set boundaries more consistently, but you feel terrible about it. Every no comes with waves of guilt. You question whether you're being too rigid, too selfish, too much. You second-guess yourself constantly. You feel like you're failing people. This stage is painful because you're acting differently, but your internal belief system hasn't caught up yet. You're protecting your energy but punishing yourself for it. Stage 5 is boundary clarity. This is where Rachel landed, and it's where this shift completes itself. The guilt disappears. The questioning stops. You have non-negotiable knowing about what you will and won't accommodate. Boundaries aren't something you have to force or maintain through willpower. They're natural expressions of your self-respect and soul protection. You say no without explanation because none is needed. Your boundaries are as natural as breathing. Stage 6 is effortless boundaries, the mature expression of this shift. Boundaries are so integrated that you rarely have to explicitly state them anymore. You've surrounded yourself with people who respect your edges. You've structured your life to honor your energy. You've become so clear in your energy field that violations are rare because people can feel your boundaries before they cross them. This isn't rigidity, it's clarity embodied. Rachel moved through all these stages over about 18 months. The relational fallout was significant. Her mother, who'd relied on Rachel to manage family dynamics, felt abandoned. Friends who'd called only when they needed something felt rejected. Colleagues who'd expected Rachel's automatic yes to extra work felt confused. Some of these relationships adapted, learned to respect Rachel's boundaries and meet her with more reciprocity. Many didn't survive. This is the cost Jung knew was inherent in individuation. He said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." And Rachel had been carrying that burden, not just her parents' unlived life, but her friends' unexpressed needs, her family's unprocessed emotions, her colleagues' avoided responsibilities. She'd been a container for everyone else's overflow, and when she stopped being that container, when she said essentially, "Carry your own weight," many people couldn't handle it. The grief was real. Even relationships that required her self-abandonment were still relationships. Even people who took advantage of her boundarylessness were still connections. Rachel spent months grieving the loss of her identity as the helpful one, the loss of relationships that couldn't survive her boundaries, the loss of the approval that had come from being endlessly available. But she also discovered something profound. The relationships that survived her boundaries became so much deeper because they were based on mutual respect rather than her one-sided giving. The people who could meet her new boundaries revealed themselves to be capable of real reciprocity. They'd been taking advantage not because they were bad people, but because she'd been offering. When she stopped offering boundaryless availability, they either stepped up or stepped away, and the ones who stepped up created relationships Rachel had never experienced before, relationships where she could receive as well as give, where her needs mattered as much as others, where she wasn't constantly depleted. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." Rachel had to confront her own darkness, the ways she'd used being needed to feel worthy, the ways she'd avoided her own soul work by managing everyone else's problems, the ways her people-pleasing was actually manipulation. "I'll meet all your needs so you'll love me and never leave me." That confrontation was painful, but it was necessary for her to develop genuine boundaries rather than boundaries built on new forms of control. I need to share my own shadow around this shift because it's easy to develop spiritual superiority about boundaries. When I first developed fierce boundary consciousness, I became judgmental of people who didn't have boundaries. I saw them as weak, as unconscious, as enabling dysfunction. I felt superior to the version of myself who'd been boundaryless. And that superiority was its own form of violence. It took a wise teacher asking me, "What are you protecting against so fiercely? What's the fear beneath all these walls you're building?" For me to see that my boundaries had become rigid rather than clear. I wasn't protecting my energy. I was protecting against intimacy. against the vulnerability of actually letting people in. I'd swung from no boundaries to walls, and I'd convinced myself those walls were spiritual maturity. True boundaries, I learned, aren't walls. They're thresholds. They're permeable membranes that let in what nourishes and keep out what depletes. But they're flexible, responsive, relational. They're not built on fear of being drained. They're built on love of what you're protecting, your soul's expansion, your authentic relationships, your capacity to be fully present rather than perpetually depleted. The mirror effect with this shift is profound. People you judge as selfish for having strong boundaries are often reflecting your own suppressed self-protection. The judgment is defensive. If you acknowledge their boundaries are healthy, you have to confront how unhealthy your boundarylessness has been. Conversely, people who trigger you by being needy or demanding or energy drains are reflecting your own disowned needs, the parts of you that want to be held, supported, tended to, the parts you've been suppressing by being the one who always gives. Both mirrors teach you about integration. Healthy boundaries aren't about never giving or never receiving. They're about genuine reciprocity, about knowing your limits, about protecting the energy required for your soul's work, while remaining open to authentic connection. Here's the warning about this shift. Boundaries can become another form of control, another way ego protects itself from genuine encounter. I have boundaries can become I have walls, and you can use those walls to avoid vulnerability, avoid challenge, avoid the discomfort of real intimacy. Jung warned about this, the danger of using psychological concepts to insulate yourself from life rather than engage with it more fully. Rachel learned this when a close friend called her out. Your boundaries have become weapons. You're using them to keep everyone at arm's length, not to protect your soul space, but to protect yourself from ever being hurt or disappointed again. That's not boundary consciousness. That's self-protection masquerading as wisdom. It devastated Rachel, and it was exactly what she needed to hear. She'd overcorrected. She'd gone from boundaryless to fortress, and she'd convinced herself that fortress was spiritual maturity. The real work was learning to have clear, firm boundaries while remaining open-hearted, to protect her energy while still allowing authentic connection, to say no to what depletes while saying yes to what nourishes. The mature expression of fierce boundary consciousness is what I call sovereignty with softness. You're absolutely clear about your limits, unshakable in protecting your soul's space. But you're also tender, vulnerable, open to genuine connection within those protected boundaries. You're not controlling who gets access to you, you're discerning, and there's a crucial difference. Rachel achieved this over time. She described it as holding boundaries without hardening my heart. She could say no clearly, immediately, without guilt, but she could also say yes fully, generously, when it was genuinely aligned. Her boundaries created the container for deeper intimacy rather than preventing it, because the people inside her boundaries knew they were there by mutual choice, not her automatic accommodation. If you're experiencing this shift, if you've discovered fierce boundary consciousness and are navigating the social consequences, I want you to comment sovereign space below, because you need to know this isn't selfishness. This isn't you being difficult or rigid or cold. This is your soul demanding the protected space it needs to expand. This is your psyche reclaiming energy that's been leaked for years. This is sacred work, even when it costs you relationships, approval, and the identity you built on being endlessly available. Jung understood that individuation requires separation from the collective before genuine connection with it becomes possible. You cannot be your authentic self while merged with everyone's expectations. You cannot become who you truly are while accommodating who everyone needs you to be. There must be separation. There must be boundaries. There must be fierce protection of your soul's space. not forever, not as the final destination, but as a necessary stage in the journey toward wholeness. The relationships you lose to your boundaries were never based on your authentic self anyway. They were based on your performance, your accommodation, your self-abandonment. Losing them creates space for relationships based on who you actually are. Relationships where you're loved for your truth rather than your usefulness, where reciprocity is real rather than one-sided, where your needs matter as much as others, and your energy, no longer leaking through weak boundaries, becomes available for your soul's expansion, for the creative work that's demanding expression, for the depth relationships that nourish rather than deplete, for the solitude that's become medicine rather than loneliness, for the becoming that requires every ounce of energy you've been giving away to people who couldn't honor its preciousness. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Looking inside requires protected space, quiet, solitude, energy that's not constantly diverted to managing others' needs and feelings. Fierce boundary consciousness creates that space. It protects the conditions necessary for awakening. This sixth shift completes when your boundaries are non-negotiable but not rigid, clear but not cold, protective but not defensive. When you can hold your edges with complete certainty while remaining open-hearted within those edges. When saying no to what depletes you becomes as natural as breathing, freeing your yes to be genuine rather than obligatory. Rachel described her life after integrating this shift as finally mine. She said, "I'm not living for anyone else's approval or comfort anymore. I'm living for my soul's expansion, and that's not selfish. It's the only thing that was ever actually mine to do. The energy I used to give away to people who didn't value it, I now invest in my own becoming, and what's emerging from that investment is more genuine, more real, more nourishing than anything I created through self-abandonment." That's the gift of fierce boundary consciousness, not isolation, not fortress living, but sovereignty, the ability to govern your own energy, protect your own space, honor your own limits while remaining capable of genuine connection within boundaries that honor your soul. Your energy is sacred. Your soul's expansion requires it, and protecting it isn't selfish. It's the most generous thing you can do. Because what emerges when you're no longer depleted, no longer accommodating everyone at the cost of yourself, no longer leaking energy through weak boundaries, that's your authentic contribution. That's your genuine medicine. That's what you actually came here to give. But you can only give it when you stop giving yourself away. The sixth shift teaches you that, and it changes everything. The seventh shift that occurs when your soul expands is urgent, non-optional, and often disruptive to the life you've built. You develop a compulsive need to create, not create for career or recognition or external validation, but create because your soul is demanding symbolic expression of its transformation. Ideas possess you, images haunt you. You wake at 4 a.m. compelled to write, to paint, to build, to make something that embodies what words alone cannot capture. Creation stops being optional leisure and becomes existential necessity. Let me tell you about Thomas. He was a 42-year-old accountant, methodical, logical, left-brained in every conventional sense. He hadn't made art since middle school, and he'd certainly never considered himself creative. His life was spreadsheets, tax codes, financial projections. And then something shifted. It started with dreams, vivid, symbolic dreams filled with images he couldn't shake. A recurring image of a tree growing through a cracked foundation. A woman made of water standing at the edge of fire. Architecture that defied physics. Buildings that breathed. He'd wake from these dreams, and the images would follow him through the day, demanding attention, refusing to be dismissed. One morning at 4 a.m., unable to sleep because an image was so insistent, Thomas got up and did something completely unlike himself. He bought canvas and paints. He had no training, no technique, no idea what he was doing, but he started painting that image from his dream, the tree, through the foundation. And something happened. Time disappeared. He lost himself completely in the act of creation. And when he finally stopped, 6 hours later, he looked at what he'd made and didn't recognize himself in it. It was crude, technically unsophisticated, but it was alive. It meant something he couldn't articulate, but knew in his bones. That was the beginning. Within months, Thomas was waking at 4 a.m. every day to paint before his real job. He filled canvases with images that emerged from somewhere deep inside him, symbols, figures, landscapes that felt ancient and familiar and completely unlike anything he'd consciously choose to create. His wife thought he was having a midlife crisis. His colleagues were confused when he started declining social invitations to paint instead. But Thomas described it as the most real thing he'd ever done. He told me, "It's not about becoming a professional artist. I don't care if anyone ever sees these paintings. It's about my soul is trying to say something, and paint is the language it's choosing. I'm translating something from unconscious to conscious, from invisible to visible, and if I don't do it, if I ignore this compulsion, I feel like I'm suffocating. The creating isn't optional anymore. It's how I breathe." This is what Jung meant when he wrote about creativity as the self's language. The self, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, expresses itself through symbols because the unconscious doesn't speak in words. It speaks in images, metaphors, symbols that carry meanings too complex for language. And when you're going through individuation, when your soul is expanding and transforming, the unconscious has a lot to say. It needs outlets for expression, and it will hijack whatever channels it can. Dreams, creativity, even symptoms if necessary. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity. The creative mind plays with the objects it loves." Notice what he's saying here. Creativity isn't intellectual production. It's not about making good art or impressive work. It's play, driven by inner necessity, the soul playing with form, expressing itself through whatever medium resonates. Let me break down how this creative imperative manifests, because it looks different for different people, and recognizing it helps you honor rather than resist it. First, sudden creative obsessions. You become fascinated with a creative form you have no history with. Thomas with painting. Someone else suddenly buys a guitar at age 50. Another person starts writing poetry daily despite never having written before. The obsession feels irrational but undeniable. You find yourself thinking about it constantly, researching it, making time for it despite having no time. Second, compulsive making at odd hours. The creating happens outside normal schedules, often in early morning or late at night when rational mind is quieter and unconscious material can surface more easily. Thomas at 4 a.m. with his paintings. A woman I know writing in notebooks between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. A man building sculptures in his garage after his family sleeps. The timing isn't convenient. It's when the soul can get through. Third, ideas that won't leave you alone. Specific images, concepts, stories, designs that persist until you give them form. They haunt you. They interrupt other activities. They demand attention. Thomas's recurring dream images, a friend plagued by a story until she wrote it. Another consumed by a design vision until he built it. These aren't casual creative ideas. They're soul material demanding incarnation. Fourth, skills emerging without formal training. You create with a facility that surprises you, as if you're accessing something that was always there. Thomas had no painting training but understood composition intuitively. People report writing in voices that aren't theirs, creating music beyond their technical skill, building things beyond their practical knowledge. Jung would say you're accessing archetypal material from the collective unconscious, patterns and capabilities that belong to all humans, but manifest uniquely through you. Fifth, creative work feeling more real than real work. Thomas described his accounting job as increasingly hollow, while his painting felt increasingly essential. This is the soul reorganizing your values. What seemed important, career success, professional identity, income security, feels meaningless compared to creative expression. Not because you're irresponsible, but because your soul's priorities have shifted dramatically. Sixth, creating for process, not product. The joy is in the making itself, not in the result or others' responses. Thomas didn't care if his paintings were good by technical standards. The act of painting was the point, the way it put him in dialogue with his unconscious, the way it allowed soul material to become visible, the way it made him feel deeply alive and authentically himself. This is creation as prayer, as meditation, as soul work rather than achievement seeking. Jung experienced this creative imperative intensely during his confrontation with the unconscious after breaking with Freud. He described feeling compelled to create mandalas, circular symbolic images, daily. He wrote, "I had to let myself be carried along by the current without a notion of where it would lead me. When I began to draw mandalas, I saw that everything, all the paths I had been following, all the steps I had taken, were leading back to a single point, namely, to the midpoint. It became increasingly plain to me that the mandala is the center. It is the exponent of all paths. It is the path to the center, to individuation." The creating wasn't optional for Jung. It was how he mapped his own psychological territory, how he made unconscious material conscious, how he navigated the transformation he was undergoing. And he understood that this creative necessity emerges for everyone undergoing individuation, maybe not mandalas, maybe not even visual art, but some form of symbolic expression through which the soul can speak. Let me give you the soul expression framework, stages of how this creative imperative typically unfolds. Stage 1 is creative hunger. You feel an inexplicable wanting that you can't initially name. It's not quite desire for a specific thing. It's more like appetite without knowing what you're hungry for. You browse art supplies, craft stores, music shops, feeling pulled without understanding toward what. This is the unconscious preparing to express itself, creating hunger before revealing what will satisfy it. Stage 2 is permission struggle. The hunger intensifies, but you resist. Who am I to create? I'm not an artist. I don't have training. I don't have time. I don't have talent. This is your ego fighting against the soul's demand, using rational objections to avoid the vulnerability and irrationality of creating from deep inner necessity. Thomas spent weeks in this stage, feeling ridiculous buying art supplies as an accountant with no experience,